Don't get in the elevator. Annie's hand clamped around the billionaire's sleeve just as the silver doors slid open. Edward Harrington jerked back. What the hell are you doing? He snapped, his voice low. Let go. The young cleaning woman did not let go. Do you have any idea who you're touching? He said. Edward Harrington was not used to being touched, stopped, or questioned. Annie's fingers trembled against the sleeve of his tailored suit, but she forced herself to keep holding on. I know who you are, she said, her voice shaking. But please, you have to trust me. Edward's face hardened. Annie looked straight at him. Don't go in, she said. Please, Mr. Harrington. Don't step in there. Edward gave a cold laugh, short and humorless. Move, he said, before I call security and have you thrown out of this building. Annie's hands trembled, but she held on. The sound is wrong, she said. The lights are wrong, and 2 men talked about the VIP shaft this afternoon. Edward stared at her. You're a cleaning girl, he said. Step back before you lose your job. The words hit her, but she did not move. I know what I heard. Edward pulled once, ready to free himself. Annie lifted her chin. Please, she said, quieter now. There's really something wrong with that elevator, sir. If you want to live, you have to listen to me. Something in her face stopped him. 1 second passed. Edward's eyes narrowed. 2 seconds. The elevator light flickered again. 3. A scream of metal tore through the shaft above them. The cabin plummeted heavily to the ground. A violent rush of air sucked toward the open doors. Annie stumbled, and Edward caught her shoulder by instinct, dragging them both backward. For a moment, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath. The elevator doors remained open. Beyond them was only a dark, empty throat falling through the center of the tower. Edward's hand was still gripping Annie's shoulder. Annie's fingers were still twisted in his sleeve. Slowly, he looked down at the wrinkled fabric where she had held him back. Then he looked at her. The anger had left his face. What? He said, his voice rough now. Did you hear? Annie opened her mouth to answer. Before she could speak, every light on the 88th floor went out. Edward had no idea that the moment he brushed Annie's hand away was also the moment the line between life and death had narrowed to mere. The darkness did not come gently. Edward Harrington stood frozen beside the open elevator shaft, his hand still gripping Annie's shoulder. For 1 second, the entire 88th floor seemed to lose its shape. The polished lobby, the glass walls, the private office doors, the executive corridor, all of it dropped into blackness. Then the emergency lights along the baseboards blinked on, thin strips of red cutting across the marble. Edward stared at them, his breathing uneven. What is this? He said. Where's the backup power? He stepped forward 2 paces, then stopped near the open elevator doors. You. He turned to Annie. How did you know? Annie's hands trembled so hard she had to press them against her uniform. I heard them, she said. This afternoon, near the emergency exit. 2 men said the VIP shaft cable would break by itself tonight. He did not know that the moment he tried to push Annie's hand away, the line between his life and death had already narrowed to a matter of seconds. Edward stared into the empty space, his mind refusing the simple math. He had been 1 step away. Then Annie pulled him back another foot. Move away from the doors, she whispered. Edward turned toward her. The building has emergency locks. That shaft should be sealed. It isn't. It will be. No, sir. Her voice was low, but there was steel under the fear. If the power went out right after it fell, that wasn't an accident. Somebody wanted the floor dark. Edward reached for his phone. No signal. He stepped toward the wall panel near the elevator and pressed the security call button. Nothing. He pressed again. Harder. The little speaker stayed dead. This floor has 3 backup systems, he said. Annie looked toward the hallway. Then somebody knew where to cut. He tried his phone again, then opened his contacts and tapped Marcus Reed, head of building security. The call failed before it rang. Damn it. Annie flinched at the sound of his anger. Who are you calling? She asked. Security. If security was coming, we'd hear them. You don't know that. I know this floor at night. Edward looked at her then. What else did you hear? He asked. She answered. 2 men near the equipment room on 86. They had maintenance uniforms, but they weren't the regular crew. Their badges were wrong. One said the VIP shaft had been handled, The cable system wouldn't argue after midnight, the other said, as long as Harrington takes his usual ride down. Edward's face went still. Only a limited circle knew he would still be in the building this late. You should have reported that. Annie's eyes flashed. To who? The men with the badges? The supervisor who tells us not to bother executives? I heard something strange. I didn't know it was this. Edward had no answer for that. He looked back at the open shaft. Stay behind me, Edward said. Annie looked at him. No. You don't know where to go. He almost objected, then stopped. Is there another elevator? He asked. They'll watch the elevators. Stairs? The main stairs are near the executive corridor, too exposed. Then where? She pointed past his shoulder. Service passage, she whispered. Cleaning staff. Trash runs. It leads down 2 floors, then splits. Locked? My card opens it. Edward stared at her. Annie reached for the badge clipped to her uniform, a cheap plastic cleaning badge on a blue lanyard. Edward almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Thank you, he said, keeping his voice low. What's your name? Annie, sir. Then lead the way, Annie. Annie bent slowly, picked up the mop handle with care, and set it across the bucket so it would not roll. She moved with quiet speed toward the hidden service door. Edward followed. She opened the door just wide enough for them to slip through, then eased it shut without letting the latch snap. Annie took a small flashlight from her cleaning belt and covered half the beam with her palm, turning it into a thin glow. This is inside my building, Edward said under his breath. Annie looked back at him. No, sir. This is behind your building. They moved down the narrow passage. Edward's phone buzzed once in his hand, then went dark again. A single bar appeared and vanished. He stopped. Annie turned. What? Maybe I can get a call out here. No, not here. The signal dies between these walls. There's a spot near 86, by the old equipment room. Sometimes my phone works there. You seem to know a great deal about the parts of this tower no one talks about. I clean them. They reached a small landing. Annie paused and listened. You said the men were near 86, he said. Yes. And you want to go there? That's where the signal is. That may also be where they came from. Annie nodded once. I know. Edward studied her face in the dim light. You're scared. Yes, sir. But you're still thinking. My mother says panic is expensive. We can't always afford it. If Annie's courage touched your heart, please like this video and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. And if you want to hear more emotional and inspiring stories like this, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Edward almost smiled. Almost. Then a sound came from above. A heavy door opened somewhere back on the 88th floor. Annie clicked off the flashlight. Edward went still. Voices drifted through the passage, faint at first, then clearer as the men entered the lobby they had just left. The footsteps came faster now. Not the slow walk of guards checking an alarm. Not the careful pace of maintenance men responding to a broken elevator. These steps were urgent, hard, closing in through the dark like men who had just learned their target was still breathing. Annie pressed herself against the wall, one hand over her mouth. Edward stood beside her, every muscle locked. The voices sharpened around the corner of the service corridor. One man cursed under his breath. Another said something too low to catch. Then came a sound Edward knew at once, though he had not heard it in years. A round being chambered. The sound was close. Too close. Only a few yards beyond the bend in the hallway. Cabins empty. The voice came from the lobby above them, muffled by the service wall but clear enough to make Annie's shoulders go rigid. Another man answered, closer and sharper. You sure? You want to climb down and check? A pause followed. Edward could picture it without seeing it. The open elevator doors, the empty shaft, the 2 men standing where he had stood less than 5 minutes ago. The place where Annie had stopped him, the place where his life had almost ended because someone knew his habits better than he knew his enemies. Then the first man spoke into a radio. He didn't go down. Annie's hand tightened around the flashlight, though it was still off. Edward saw her knuckles pale in the red spill from the emergency light behind them. The second man cursed. Find him before anyone gets a call out. Footsteps crossed the marble above them. Slow at first, then spreading apart. One man moving toward the offices, another toward the service corridor. A drawer opened somewhere. A door slammed. The sound carried through the walls like the building itself was betraying them. Check the offices, one of the men said. He wouldn't know the back routes. Annie looked at Edward. He heard the words the way she did. He wouldn't know. Not they wouldn't know. He. The men were thinking about Edward, not about Annie. To them, she was not part of the problem yet. That mistake might be the only thing keeping them alive. Edward leaned closer. How far to the signal spot? 1 floor down, she whispered. Maybe less than that, if we take the west service stairs. Can we get there without crossing an open hallway? Annie hesitated. Not all the way. The handle on the service door above rattled. Annie's eyes widened. Edward stepped toward it, his shoulder angling as if he could hold back the door with his body. She grabbed his wrist. Don't. I can block it. They may have tools. We need distance. The handle rattled again, harder. A man's voice came through the door, muffled but close. Service passage. He's got help. Edward looked at Annie. The accusation in those words struck him harder than he expected. Not she saved him. Not there's a witness. Help. A problem. Something to remove. Annie pointed down. They moved. The stairs were narrow, metal, and colder than the polished world outside. Edward kept one hand on the railing. Dust came off on his palm. He had signed billion-dollar agreements, bought failing companies, faced attorneys who would smile while destroying a man, but nothing in those rooms had prepared him for this. Following an 18-year-old cleaner down a hidden staircase while men with guns searched his tower. At the next landing, Annie stopped so suddenly Edward nearly ran into her. Below them, another door clicked open. A third voice drifted up from the darkness. Cut them off at 86. Annie looked up at Edward. For the first time since the elevator fell, he saw fear break through her discipline. They know this passage, she whispered. Edward looked down into the dark, then back toward the door above. How? I don't know. Yes, you do, Annie swallowed. The men I heard this afternoon. They came from somewhere near here. If they used this passage once, they can use it again. The trap was no longer the elevator. It was the building. Edward took that in, then made himself stop thinking like a man whose name was on the lobby wall. The tower was compromised. The main systems were useless. His access card might expose them. His office was too far. The garage was impossible. The only working advantage they had was Annie's knowledge of the places no executive noticed. Annie, he said softly. Is there any way off this staircase before 86? She closed her eyes for half a second, not in prayer, but in memory. Laundry chute access on 87, not a real chute anymore. They sealed it after the renovation, but there's a maintenance crawl beside it. It leads behind the conference pantry. Can we fit? I can, you. She looked at his shoulders. Maybe if you stop moving like the hallway owes you space. Under different circumstances, Edward might have objected. Instead, he nodded. Show me. They climbed back up 3 steps, then crossed a narrow landing barely wide enough for both of them. Annie ran her hand along the wall until she found a metal panel almost invisible under layers of gray paint. She slid her cleaning badge under the edge and pried. The panel stuck. The door above them shook. A man said, "Open it." Another answered, "Reader's locked. Give me the bypass." Edward crouched beside Annie. Move. She did, but only enough to give him room. Edward hooked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel resisted, then opened with a soft metallic pop. Annie winced at the sound. Both of them froze. No shout came from above. Inside was a crawl space no higher than Edward's chest, lined with pipes and bundled cables. Dust hung in the stale air. Annie slipped in first without complaint. Edward followed, folding himself into the space with more difficulty than dignity. His suit caught on a screw. He pulled free and heard fabric tear. Annie glanced back. "Don't say it," he whispered. "I wasn't going to. You were thinking it. I was thinking the jacket costs more than my semester." Edward almost answered, but the service door below them opened. A flashlight beam cut across the landing they had just left. Both of them went still inside the wall. A man climbed the stairs slowly. His light swept the railing, the steps, the metal panel. Edward held his breath until his chest burned. Annie was inches ahead of him, one hand pressed flat to the dusty floor of the crawl space, eyes fixed on a spot in front of her. She looked terrified, but she did not shake now. The flashlight paused on the panel. Edward's phone screen lit faintly in his hand. He closed his fist around it too late. The light below snapped upward. "You see that?" the man said. Annie moved before Edward could understand what she was doing. She took the small bottle of floor polish from her belt, twisted the cap loose, and rolled it down through a gap near the far side of the panel. The bottle hit the stairs below with a plastic clatter, then bounced down 2 steps. The flashlight jerked away. What was that? Over there. The man moved down. His footsteps retreated. Annie crawled forward fast. Edward followed, jaw tight, knees scraping metal. The space narrowed, then bent sharply left. Pipes pressed close to his shoulder. He had to turn sideways and drag himself through. For a moment, he was stuck. Annie looked back. "Mr. Harrington? I'm fine." "You're not." "I said I'm fine." She crawled back 2 feet, reached past him, and tugged the torn edge of his jacket free from a pipe bracket. "Now you are." He exhaled. "Thank you. Save it for when we're out." They emerged behind a pantry wall on the 87th floor. Annie pushed a loose vent grill outward and slid into the dark room beyond. Edward came after her, landing harder than he meant to. The pantry smelled of coffee pods, paper cups, and the sweet chemical scent of unopened creamer. For a few seconds they listened. Nothing. Then Edward's phone buzzed. 1 bar appeared. Annie pointed to the counter near the far wall. "There. Stand by the microwave." "I don't know why, but that corner sometimes catches signal." Edward moved to it and called Marcus Reed again. This time, the call rang once. Then it cut. He tried again. Nothing. A text came through instead. Not from Marcus. From Linda Shaw. "Sir, stay where you are. Security is coming." Edward stared at the message. Annie read his face. "Who is it?" "My assistant." "Did you tell her where you are?" "No." "Then how does she know you're alive?" Edward did not answer. Another message appeared. "Do not move. Mr. Vale has been notified." Annie's voice dropped. "Who's Mr. Vale?" Edward looked at the screen, then toward the pantry door. Someone who should not know anything yet. A sound came from the hallway outside the pantry. Not footsteps this time. A keycard beep. Then a man's voice, close enough to hear through the door. 87 pantry. Check it." Annie killed the phone's glow with her palm. Edward slipped it into his pocket. The pantry door handle began to turn. The handle stopped halfway. Annie did not breathe. Edward stood beside the microwave with his back to the wall, one hand inside his jacket around the phone, the other hanging loose at his side. He had nothing that could stop a man with a gun. That thought came to him with a clarity that was almost insulting. He had private security, armored cars, lawyers on retainer, accounts in 3 countries, and none of it mattered in a dark pantry on the 87th floor. The handle turned again. Annie looked at the floor, then the counter, then the narrow space beneath the sink. Edward followed her eyes and shook his head once. "No." She pointed toward the rolling trash bin beside the pantry door, then to the metal rack of coffee supplies. Her lips formed the words without sound. "When it opens," Edward understood just enough to hate the plan. The door opened 2 inches. A flashlight beam slid through the gap and swept across the floor. It passed over Edward's shoes first. The man outside froze. "Got something," he said. Annie shoved the rolling trash bin with both hands. It slammed into the opening door and struck the man's knee. He cursed and stumbled back. Edward grabbed the metal rack and yanked it sideways. Boxes of coffee pods, paper cups, stir sticks, sugar packets, and plastic lids crashed across the floor. The sound filled the hallway, cheap and chaotic. "Move," Annie said. She pulled Edward through the gap between the counter and the fallen rack. He followed her out through a second door at the back of the pantry, a service exit he had not known existed. Behind them, the man forced the main door open and kicked the trash bin aside. "There," he shouted. Annie and Edward ran. The corridor outside the pantry was narrower than the executive hall but wider than the crawl space. Lined with storage doors and framed prints nobody had bothered to straighten. Red emergency light washed the carpet in broken strips. Annie kept one hand on the wall as she moved, counting doors under her breath. 3, 4, 5. "What are you counting?" Edward asked. "Turns." "Why?" "So I don't panic." At the 6th door, she stopped and swiped her badge. The reader blinked red. She swiped again. Red. Edward looked back. A flashlight jumped at the end of the corridor. Annie, I know. She bent, wiped the card quickly against her uniform, and tried once more. Green. The door opened into a supply room stacked with folded tablecloths, cleaning pads, extra soap dispensers, and boxes of bottled water for executive meetings. Annie pulled Edward inside and closed the door by hand, easing the latch until it clicked without echo. The footsteps passed outside seconds later. One man said, "They came this way." Another voice answered, farther back, "Vale wants him alive if possible." Edward's body went still. If possible, that was not comfort. That was hierarchy. Richard Vale, if the message was true, was no longer a suspicion at the edge of the night. He had become a name attached to orders. Annie heard it too. "Vale," she whispered. "That's the man from the text." Edward nodded. "He works for you?" "He works under me. Not tonight." The truth of that sat between them. Edward looked at the shelves, at the folded tablecloths and bottled water. This was another room built for the comfort of men who would never enter it. The things inside would appear in conference rooms as if summoned by money. Annie knew where they came from. He lowered his voice. "Who else has access to these service routes?" "Cleaning staff, maintenance, security, sometimes catering." "Executives?" She almost smiled. "No offense, sir, but most executives don't know where the trash goes after they leave a room." Edward accepted that because it was true. His phone vibrated again. This time the signal held for half a second, long enough for a voicemail notification to appear. Marcus Reed. Edward tapped it and held the phone close. The message came through in broken pieces, but Marcus's voice was there, strained and low. "Mr. Harrington, if you get this, don't trust Vale." Maintenance logs were changed after 6 p.m. 2 temporary contractors entered under executive override. I tried to lock the floor down, but Linda's credentials were used to reroute the alert. "I'm in security room B, 82. They locked me in. Do not use the main elevators. Repeat, do not." The message cut out. Annie stared at the phone. Edward's face had gone hard again, but not the arrogant hardness from before. This was something colder, focused. "Linda Shaw?" Annie asked. "My assistant? The same woman who texted you?" "Yes." Then she knew. Edward did not answer right away. Linda had worked outside his office for 9 years. She knew his calendar, his habits, the names of his drivers, the way he took coffee, the doctors he ignored, the board members he disliked, the hotel he used when he was too tired to go home. He had trusted efficiency and mistaken it for loyalty. Annie touched the shelf lightly, listening through it. "What's on 82? She asked. "Security room B, backup monitoring station. Can Marcus call police from there?" "If the line works. And if it doesn't?" Edward looked at his phone. "We need a stronger signal. There's a spot near the old equipment room on 86, like I said. But if they know these passages, they'll expect us to go down. Then we go somewhere they don't expect." "Where?" "My office." Annie stared at him. "Your office is on 88. That's where they started looking. It also has a standalone drive with access logs. Elevator control, maintenance records, security overrides. If Vale is behind this, the proof may be there." "Sir, we are trying to get out. If I get out with nothing, Vale will control the story by morning." Elevator malfunction. Tragic accident avoided. Confused young cleaner. Security misunderstanding. Annie's expression changed at the word confused. Edward noticed. "That's what they'll call me," she said, confused. He did not soften it. "Yes." She looked away toward the door, jaw tight. Edward said, "You heard them. You saw the men. You saved my life. But if Richard Vale has the system, the lawyers, and the first public statement, he'll make you sound like someone who got scared in the dark." Annie was quiet. Outside, footsteps receded, then returned farther down the hall. The men were searching room by room. Annie looked back at Edward. "What's on that drive?" "Names, times, overrides. If the elevator was accessed with executive authorization, it will show whose credentials were used." "Can you get it fast?" "Yes." "Do you know a back way into your own office?" Edward opened his mouth, then closed it. Annie gave him a look. He exhaled. "No, I do." That should have embarrassed him. It did. "There's a catering corridor behind the boardroom," Annie said. It connects to a pantry near your office. If we stay off the main hallway, we can get close. But if they catch us up there, they won't. You don't know that. No, Edward said. But I know I'm done letting them decide what happens next. Annie studied him for a second, measuring whether this was courage or pride. Maybe it was both. She had seen men like him in passing all year. Men who confused being obeyed with being right. But this was different. His voice had changed since the elevator. Less command, more weight. She picked up a small flashlight from a shelf, then a roll of silver duct tape and a clean microfiber cloth. Edward watched her. What's that for? Rich people keep safes, she said. Cleaning people keep useful things. This time Edward did smile, just barely. A hard knock hit the door. Both of them froze. A man outside said, "This one's locked." Another voice answered, "Open it." Annie killed the flashlight and stepped close to Edward. "There's a vent behind the tablecloths," she whispered. "It leads to the catering corridor." Edward looked at the stacked shelves blocking the back wall. "Of course it does," he muttered. The lock beeped. Red. The man outside tried again. Red. Then came the sound of metal against metal. Annie moved first, pulling tablecloths down in silent bundles. Edward helped, stacking them against the floor to muffle the sound. Behind the shelves was a square service vent with 4 screws. Edward reached for it, but Annie caught his hand and held up the duct tape. She pressed tape over each screw before loosening them with a small tool from her belt. The screws came free without dropping. Edward stared. "My mother hates when I wake her up fixing things at night," Annie whispered. "You learn not to let screws hit the floor." The door lock beeped again. Green. Annie pulled the vent cover loose. The supply room door began to open. The supply room door opened just as Annie slid through the vent. Edward followed. Not gracefully. His shoulder struck the metal frame, and the torn edge of his jacket caught again. Annie reached back, grabbed the lapel, and pulled hard enough to make him grunt. The fabric ripped another inch, but he came through. Behind them, light cut across the supply room. "Empty," a man said. "Check behind the shelves." Annie pressed a finger to her lips. They were in a low service tunnel that ran behind the conference rooms. It smelled of drywall dust, warm wiring, and old coffee. Edward had to crouch to keep from hitting his head. Annie moved faster, one hand sliding along the wall, counting under her breath again. 2 panels then left. "Don't touch the blue cable." Edward looked at the bundles above his shoulder. "Why?" "I don't know. Last guy who touched it killed the Wi-Fi on half the floor. Even there, with armed men behind them, and a ruined elevator below." Edward almost laughed. It came out as a breath. From the supply room, something crashed. The men had found the vent. "They went through here." Annie moved faster. "Now we hurry." The tunnel narrowed. Edward had to turn sideways, carrying his phone and the small drive case he had taken from the pantry shelf without thinking. A foolish habit, grabbing anything that looked important. He stopped and left the empty case behind. Weight mattered now. Sound mattered. Pride mattered least. Annie reached a metal grate and looked through it. Beyond was a catering corridor with dim emergency lighting, rolling carts lined against one wall, and framed photographs from company charity galas no one had bothered to straighten after the power dropped. She listened. No footsteps. She eased the grate open and climbed out. Edward followed, landing on one knee on the carpet. His palm touched something sticky. Probably spilled coffee from some executive meeting. He wiped it against his pants and stood. Annie noticed but said nothing. The corridor outside the boardroom looked different without full power. Usually it was warm, indirect light, quiet luxury, walnut doors and frosted glass. Now, it was a red-lit passage full of shadows. The nameplates on the doors seemed too bright, as if the building were still pretending nothing had happened. Edward pointed down the hall. "My office is through the boardroom and right." "No," Annie whispered. "The boardroom, there's a pantry behind the boardroom?" She looked at him. "You have coffee up here in your meetings, right?" He accepted that and followed. They slipped past a row of catering carts. Annie stopped at the third one and pulled a white service jacket from underneath. "Put this on." Edward stared. "You want me to disguise myself as catering staff? I want you less visible than a tall man in a torn $5,000 suit." 7. "What?" "The suit." Annie gave him a look that made him regret saying it. He put on the jacket. It barely fit across his shoulders. The sleeves ended above his wrists. Annie took the microfiber cloth and wiped a smear of dust across the front. "Really?" he whispered. "You look too clean. I was nearly killed 10 minutes ago, and you still look like you expect somebody to bring you sparkling water." That time, despite himself, Edward smiled. It vanished quickly when they heard voices in the service tunnel behind them. The men were coming. Annie led him to a narrow pantry door and swiped her card, green on the first try. Inside, the room was dark and cramped, with a sink, cabinets, a silent espresso machine, and stacks of porcelain cups. A second door opened into the rear of the boardroom. Edward moved toward it. Annie caught his arm. "Wait." She crouched and looked under the door. A thin beam of light shifted on the carpet beyond. "Someone's in there," she breathed. Edward bent beside her. Through the gap, he saw 2 pairs of shoes near the long conference table. One pair belonged to a man in work boots. The other were polished black dress shoes, not Richard Vale's. Edward knew Richard's shoes, Italian, narrow, always shined. These were broader, security issue maybe. A voice said, "Vale said the drive is in the office wall safe." Edward went cold. The second voice answered, "Then why aren't we in the office? Because if Harrington's alive, he'll come for it. Men like him don't run. They go back for what they think they own." Annie looked at Edward. The words stung because they were accurate. Edward forced himself not to react. He leaned closer to the gap and listened. The first man continued. "Shaw says he keeps a backup laptop in there too. Black case. If he reaches either one, the boss has a problem. Linda Shaw." Edward closed his eyes once, briefly. 9 years of calendar access. 9 years of loyalty performed so well he had mistaken it for character. Annie touched his sleeve. Gentle this time. Not stopping him. Grounding him. He opened his eyes. "We still need the drive," he whispered. "They're waiting for you to try. Then we don't enter the way they expect." Annie scanned the pantry. Cabinets, sink, ceiling vent, service dumbwaiter panel, no longer used, sealed but not fully. Her eyes stopped on the ceiling above the espresso machine. "Is your office next to the boardroom? On the other side of the glass wall? Does it share the ceiling space?" Edward looked up. Probably. I don't build ceilings, Annie. You own 88 floors and don't know what's above your head. I'm beginning to see the pattern." She stood on the counter and pushed at a ceiling tile. It lifted, shifted, and revealed a dark gap. Edward looked doubtful. "You expect me to climb through that? I expect you to decide whether you want proof or comfort." He removed the ridiculous service jacket and handed it to her. Proof. Getting him into the ceiling took 30 seconds they did not have. Annie climbed first, then braced one foot against a support beam and helped guide him up. Edward had upper body strength from expensive gyms and private trainers, but none of that prepared him for moving quietly above a boardroom while men below discussed killing him as an inconvenience. The ceiling space was tighter than the vent. Metal beams ran across in a grid. Wires brushed his back. Annie crawled ahead, testing each panel before shifting weight. "Only step on the beams," she whispered. "Not the tiles." "I know." "No, you don't. You said probably." He shut his mouth. Below them, the men in the boardroom moved closer. "He should have been in the elevator," one said. "Doesn't matter. We find him. Vale cleans it up." "And the girl?" There was a pause. Edward looked at Annie. In the faint red light seeping from below, her face had gone still. The answer came. "Witnesses are problems." Edward felt a heat rise in him that was more than fear. Annie kept crawling. They reached the ceiling space above his office. Edward recognized the layout from the pattern of recessed lights and the position of the window wall. His desk would be below. The wall safe was behind the large abstract painting near the bookshelf. Annie lifted a tile enough to peer down. "Clear," she whispered. Edward lowered himself first, dropping onto the carpet with a soft thud. Annie came after him, lighter. His office smelled faintly of leather and cold coffee. The city glowed beyond the glass, indifferent and beautiful. Edward moved to the painting and slid it aside. Behind it was a biometric safe. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. Nothing. The scanner stayed dark. "Power's out," Annie said. "It has a battery. Maybe somebody pulled it." Edward ran his fingers along the lower edge of the safe, found the manual override plate, and removed it. There's a mechanical key in my desk. Annie was already moving. Top drawer? Second. She opened it, stopped, and lifted out a small framed photo instead of the key. A boy of about 12 stood beside an older man in a mechanic's shirt, both holding up a rebuilt engine part. Edward reached for it without thinking. My father, he said. Annie handed it to him. He worked with machines. He fixed them. I bought them. There was no time for the memory, but it came anyway. His father's hands black with grease. His voice saying, "A machine tells you when it's hurting, Eddie. Most men don't listen until it breaks." Edward looked at the dead safe. Second drawer, left side, he said. Annie found the key. He opened the safe. Inside were folders, a passport case, cash, a sealed envelope, a black emergency phone, and the standalone security drive, no larger than a deck of cards. He took the drive. At the same moment, his desk phone lit up. Both of them froze. The speaker crackled. Then Richard Vale's voice filled the office, smooth and calm. "Edward, if you're in there, don't do anything foolish." Edward stared at the phone. Annie whispered, "He knows." The office door handle moved. Then Richard spoke again, softer now. "And please don't make this worse for the girl." Edward did not answer Richard. He reached across the desk and pressed the speaker button, killing the voice in the room. The silence that followed was worse, because now they could hear the office door handle moving again, slow and careful. Annie stepped back from the desk, eyes on the door. Edward slipped the security drive into the inside pocket of his torn jacket. "Is there another way out? You mean besides the ceiling we just came through?" "Yes." Annie scanned the office. Glass wall, bookshelf, private restroom, executive closet, heavy desk, no obvious exit. Men like Edward built rooms to impress visitors, not escape enemies. The handle stopped. A man outside said, "Doors locked." Richard's voice came through the hallway, no longer on speaker but close enough to carry. "Then open it." Edward looked toward the ceiling tile they had used, too slow. If he tried to climb first, they would be caught before Annie got up. If Annie climbed first, the men might be inside before Edward followed. Annie pointed to the private restroom. "There. That's a bathroom. It has a service panel. I've seen maintenance use one on this floor." Edward did not argue. They moved into the restroom and Annie closed the door without letting it click. The room was larger than the kitchen in her apartment. White stone, steel fixtures, a folded towel beside the sink no one had touched. Annie found the panel behind a narrow cabinet near the supply shelf. It was held by two push latches. She pressed both. Nothing. Edward heard a soft beep from the office door. Annie pressed harder. The panel opened half an inch. From the office, a card reader chirped again. Green. Edward turned the restroom lock just as the office door opened. Footsteps entered his office. "Mr. Harrington," Richard called, calm as a man entering a meeting. "This has gone far enough." Annie pulled the service panel wide. Behind it was a vertical maintenance shaft barely large enough for a person to move sideways. Pipes ran down the wall. A metal ladder disappeared into darkness. Edward looked at it. "You have got to be kidding." Annie whispered, "You want proof or comfort?" He gave her a look. "I'm going." She climbed in first, finding the ladder with one foot. Edward followed, pulling the panel back into place behind them. It did not shut all the way. A thin line of restroom light cut across the shaft. They froze. The restroom door opened. A flashlight swept across the sinks. The man outside stepped in, breathing through his nose. Annie held the ladder with both hands, her cheek nearly against a cold pipe. Edward was above her, one arm braced. His expensive shoes balanced on a rung never meant for them. A cabinet opened, then another. The man stepped closer to the service panel. Edward felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and closed his hand over it. But the faint buzz had already sounded in the shaft. The man stopped. Annie looked up at Edward. He did the only thing he could think of. He took the folded hand towel from his pocket. He had grabbed it without knowing. Maybe from the restroom counter. Maybe from instinct, and dropped it down the shaft. It fell past Annie's shoulder and landed somewhere below with a soft slap against metal. The man outside turned. Sound came from below. Richard's voice answered from the office. "Then go below." The restroom door closed. Annie did not move for 3 seconds. Then she started down. The ladder vibrated under their weight. The shaft was colder than the office, carrying air from lower mechanical floors. Edward's shoulders scraped both sides. At one point he had to remove the ridiculous catering jacket still half tucked under his arm and let it drop. It vanished into the dark below. Annie heard it land and whispered, $7,000 suit and a stolen service jacket. You're having a night. Focus, Annie. I am. Humor keeps people breathing. He could not argue with that. They climbed down one level, then another. A small stencil on the wall read 86. Annie stopped at a side panel and pressed her ear against it. Edward listened too. Voices, distant, footsteps, not close, a mechanical hum. Somewhere, an alarm chirped once and died. This is near the old equipment room, she whispered. Signal spot should be 20 feet outside. Can we get out there? If the hall is clear, she pushed the panel. It opened into a narrow storage alcove, lined with old cable reels and boxes marked Archive, Do Not Discard. They slipped inside. Edward checked his phone. 1 bar, then 2. Before he could call, a message appeared from Linda Shaw. Sir, Mr. Vale says you may be confused. Stay calm. Tell me where you are, and we can help. Edward stared at the words until they blurred into insult. Annie read over his shoulder. She's fishing. Yes. Don't answer. I wasn't planning to. He dialed 900 ELF. The call tried to connect, clicked, then failed. He swore under his breath and tried Marcus again. This time the call rang once. A broken voice came through. Harrington. Marcus. Thank God. Where are you? 86. Old equipment side. Annie Johnson is with me. She saved my life. A pause. Not doubt. Just Marcus processing fast. Listen carefully. Vale's using temporary contractor credentials. Linda's access rerouted the initial alert. I'm locked in security room B on 82. Main dispatch line is dead. I can trigger manual alarm if I get backup power restored, but we don't have 4 minutes. You have the drive? Edward looked at Annie. Yes. Then don't go down. They'll expect down. Vale wants the drive before police get a clean scene. The line crackled. Edward stepped closer to the wall, chasing the signal. Marcus, who else is with Vale? 2 contractors on upper floors, maybe a third. I heard a name on radio traffic. Shaw. She fed them your schedule. Vale is on 12, using temporary command. The words landed hard, but there was no time to feel them. Marcus continued, weaker now. Edward, the Singapore call is at 1. If you miss it, and Vale has control. He signs. The call dropped. Edward lowered the phone. Annie watched him. What happens if he signs? He locks in the acquisition under terms I rejected. Hundreds of millions move before morning. By the time anyone asks questions, he'll blame the elevator, the outage, the confusion, and me. Edward looked at her. Annie's voice stayed steady, but her face had tightened. He'll say I imagined things, that I scared you, that I made it messy. Edward remembered Richard's voice. Don't make this worse for the girl. Yes, he said, he will. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had known long before tonight. Then we need more than the drive. We have access logs. We need his voice. Edward studied her. You want him to admit it? I want him to think he's talking to someone he already beat. A sound came from the hallway. Not close, but moving toward them. Edward put the phone in his pocket. We keep moving. Annie opened the alcove door an inch and looked out. The corridor beyond was dim, broken by red emergency light. At the far end, near the equipment room, a camera hung from the ceiling. Its little red indicator blinked once, went dark, then blinked again. Annie pulled back. What? Edward whispered. They're not blind. The cameras? They're blinking. Somebody's choosing when to look. Edward leaned past her and saw the light pulse again. Short, long, short. The same rhythm Annie had seen in the elevator. From the far end of the hall came a man's voice. 86 is live. Check the old equipment room. Annie shut the alcove door softly. Edward looked at the ceiling, the walls, the floor. all of it suddenly suspect. Annie whispered, "They know we're here." The footsteps turned into the corridor. The footsteps stopped outside the alcove. Annie held the door handle with one hand and pressed her other palm flat against the wall, as if she could feel the men through the plaster. Edward stood behind her, the security drive hidden inside his torn jacket, his phone dark in his fist. For a man who had spent 30 years controlling rooms, he had never felt a room shrink around him like this. A flashlight beam slid under the alcove door. Annie did not move. The man outside breathed once, slow and close. Then his radio crackled. "Anything?" "Old equipment hall," the man answered. "Doors shut. Open it." The handle turned. Annie pulled Edward backward, deeper between the stacked archive boxes. There was nowhere to hide. The alcove was barely a room, just a forgotten pocket beside the corridor, full of things too old to use and too inconvenient to throw away. Edward looked at the boxes. Outdated routers, backup cables, paper records, broken desk phones. Things the tower had kept because no one important had decided what they were worth. Annie's eyes moved fast. Shelf, floor, ceiling, camera wire, sprinkler pipe. A metal maintenance hatch half covered by a box marked Holiday Decor. She pointed. Edward understood. The alcove door opened. Annie kicked the bottom shelf. 3 boxes slid forward and crashed onto the floor between them and the doorway. Old cables spilled across the tiles like black snakes. The man outside cursed and stepped back. In that second, Annie shoved the holiday box aside and yanked the maintenance hatch open. "Go," she whispered. Edward hesitated. "You first." "No, you have the drive." That was not bravery. It was calculation. He hated that she was right. He ducked through the hatch into a low side corridor, then turned and reached back. Annie came after him just as a flashlight swept over the fallen boxes. "There," the man shouted. Edward grabbed Annie's wrist and pulled her through. She slammed the hatch behind them. It had no lock, only a thumb latch. Edward slid a loose metal rod through the handle, jamming it. A fist hit the other side, then another. The rod bent but held. Annie was already moving. The side corridor ran parallel to the old equipment room, narrower than the last passage and hotter, with exposed pipes overhead. The floor vibrated with machinery from somewhere below. Edward could hear the man behind them calling for tools. "How many of these routes are there?" he asked. "Enough that nobody fixes them until something breaks. And tonight everything's broken." "No," Annie said, breathing hard. "Tonight somebody broke it on purpose." They reached a junction. Left led toward a marked emergency stairwell. Right dropped into darker service space. Edward pointed left. "Stairs." Annie shook her head. "Too obvious. We need to get to Marcus on 82. They know that too. And your signal spot? They know that now. So where?" She looked down the right side. "Laundry service run. It connects to the old catering lift. It doesn't work. But the shaft has a ladder. We can drop to 85. Maybe 84. Maybe?" She gave him a tired look. "Mr. Harrington, I usually take trash through here, not billionaires." The line should not have steadied him, but it did. "Then take the billionaire where you'd take the trash." She blinked once, then almost smiled. "Yes, sir." They went right. Behind them, metal scraped. The hatch would not hold long. Edward's phone buzzed again. He glanced down. Richard Vale. He let it ring once. Annie saw the name. "Answer it." Edward looked at her. "You said, don't answer. That was Linda. This is him. He'll trace the call. He already knows we're on 86. Make him talk." Edward stared at her for half a second. In another life, with better lighting and less danger, he would have asked how a girl who cleaned floors understood leverage so cleanly. He answered and put the phone on speaker, volume low. "Richard, Edward." Vale sounded calm, almost relieved. "Thank God. I was afraid we'd lost connection. You cut my building open and dropped my elevator. Don't waste my time pretending concern." A pause, small but real. Annie looked at Edward and nodded slightly. "Good." He had hit something. Richard recovered. "You're under stress. There has been a catastrophic mechanical failure, and you are being influenced by a young employee who does not understand what's happening." Edward kept walking, following Annie through the dark. She understood enough to keep me out of that elevator. She startled you away from a malfunction. That is not the same as understanding. Annie's jaw tightened. Edward saw it. Richard continued, voice smooth. Listen to me. Give yourself up to my security team. Let them bring you downstairs. We can contain the story before the press turns this into something ugly. The story? The market opens in a few hours. The Singapore call is still pending. Your absence creates uncertainty. Uncertainty destroys value. There it is, Edward said. There what is? The thing you care about. Richard sighed, like a disappointed friend. Edward, you and I have spent 20 years building something larger than either of us. Don't let fear and one cleaning girl's imagination burn it down in a single night. Annie stopped moving. Edward stopped too. The phrase hung in the cramped corridor. One cleaning girl's imagination. Edward looked at Annie. Her eyes were steady now, but he could see the old wound behind them. Not from Richard alone. From every room where someone had decided her uniform made her less reliable, less visible, less worth hearing. Edward's voice changed. Her name is Annie Johnson. Richard was silent. Edward said it again, quieter. Her name is Annie Johnson, and she has been right every time tonight. Annie looked away quickly, but not before Edward saw her face shift. Richard's tone hardened by 1 degree. That sentiment may play well in front of cameras. It won't help you here. No cameras, Richard? Another pause. Annie touched Edward's arm and pointed ahead. At the end of the corridor, a small dome camera blinked above a pipe bend. Short, long, short. Edward smiled without warmth. I thought you were watching. Richard said nothing. Edward continued. Tell me something. Did you choose midnight because of the Singapore call, or because you thought the night staff would be easy to dismiss? Richard's voice dropped. Be very careful. Dead men don't block signatures, do they? The silence that followed was longer this time. Then Richard said, You always did think you were the only man in the room who understood timing. The call ended. Edward looked at the phone. Annie whispered, Did it record? Edward checked. His recording app had been open since the pantry. The red timer still ran. Yes. Not enough, she said. No, but it's a start. A heavy bang echoed from behind. The hatch had given way. Move, Edward said. They reached the old catering lift. It was a narrow metal door with a faded out-of-service sticker peeling from one corner. Annie pried it open with the end of the mop handle she had somehow kept with her all this time. Edward noticed. You brought the mop? The handle, sir, not the whole mop. Of course. Inside was a dark shaft with a fixed ladder along one side. Annie shone her covered flashlight down. 85 is close. 84 is safer if the ladder holds. If? She started down. You ask a lot of questions for a man being rescued. Edward followed. The ladder groaned under his weight but held. He climbed carefully, one rung at a time, the drive pressing against his chest. Above them, footsteps entered the corridor they had left. A voice shouted, Lift shaft. Annie moved faster. Don't rush, Edward whispered. You first told me you don't run in your own building. I've revised my position. They reached the 85th floor access door. Annie tested it. Jammed. She climbed lower. Edward followed, sweat running down his back under the torn suit. At 84, Annie pushed the door. It opened an inch, then stuck against something outside. Blocked, she said. Can you force it? Not quietly. Above them, the old lift door opened. A flashlight shot down the shaft. There. Edward looked at Annie below him. There was no space to climb back. No room to fight. No time to think like a chairman. He braced one foot against the ladder and shoved the 84th floor door with his shoulder. Once, it moved another inch. Again, the metal screamed. Annie slipped through the gap first, then pulled from the other side while Edward pushed. The door gave just enough for him to force his body through. He landed hard on the floor beside her. They were in a dark storage hall on 84. Behind them, a man started down the ladder. Annie grabbed the mop handle and shoved it through the lift door handles like a bar. It won't hold long, Edward said. It doesn't have to. She pointed down the hall. At the far end, faint blue light bled through a narrow window in a fire door. Edward's phone showed 1 bar again. Then 2. Annie breathed out. That's the spot. They ran toward it. Just as Edward raised the phone to call 911, a message flashed across the screen from an unknown number. "Stop running, Edward. You are making this worse for the girl." Edward stared at the message for half a second too long. "Stop running, Edward. You are making this worse for the girl." Annie saw his face change before she saw the words. "What is it?" He turned the screen toward her. She read it once. Her lips pressed together, but she did not fall apart. That steadiness bothered Edward more than tears would have. 18 years old, trapped in a dark tower with armed men, and she already understood how threats worked when they were dressed up as concern. "They know your number," she said. "They know more than that. They want you scared for me." Edward looked toward the lift shaft behind them. The mop handle rattled once against the metal door. The man on the other side had reached the bottom. "It's working," he said. Annie shook her head. "No. It's making you angry." "That's different." The mop handle bent. Edward lifted the phone and dialed 911. The call connected, then hissed with static. 911, what is your emergency?" Edward stepped closer to the narrow window in the fire door, raising the phone. "This is Edward Harrington. I'm inside Harrington Financial Tower, 84th floor. My executive elevator was sabotaged. There are armed men inside the building." The line cracked. "Sir, repeat your location." "Harrington Financial Tower, 84th floor. Send police and fire rescue." Another burst of static ate the reply. Annie reached for the phone. "May I?" Edward handed it over. She put one hand over her free ear and spoke clearly, not loud, not frantic. "This is Annie Johnson, night cleaning staff at Harrington Financial Tower in downtown Chicago. Executive elevator cable failed at approximately 11:48 p.m. Mr. Edward Harrington is alive. We are on the 84th floor near the west fire door. 2 or more unidentified men posing as maintenance are searching the upper floors. Building communication has been cut. We need police, fire rescue, and a full building lockdown." Edward looked at her. She gave the information the way a nurse gave vitals or a dispatcher gave coordinates. No wasted words, no pleading. The operator's voice sharpened. "Annie, are you in immediate danger?" "Yes, ma'am." A slam came from the lift door behind them. Annie did not look back. "Are the suspects armed?" She glanced at Edward. "We heard a weapon being loaded." The operator said, "Units are being dispatched. Stay on the line if you can." The signal broke into static again. Annie moved the phone an inch closer to the window. "Ma'am, we may lose you. Please tell responding officers there may be compromised security credentials inside the building. Do not rely on building staff unless verified." Edward almost interrupted, then stopped. She was right. The operator began to respond, but the call failed. The screen went dark. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Edward said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mother's a nurse. She says if you call for help, don't scream the problem. Give them what they need to find you. She taught you well." She had to. The mop handle snapped behind them. The lift door banged open. "Go," Edward said. They ran through the fire door into a narrow cross corridor that connected storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and a small employee break area. The blue light Annie had seen came from an old vending machine still running on a backup circuit. Its plastic front glowed over rows of chips, candy bars, and bottled tea, absurdly normal in the middle of the night's collapse. Annie stopped beside it. Edward looked at her. "This is not the time for a snack." "Camera." She pointed to the black dome above the vending machine. Its red light blinked steadily. Not in the strange, short rhythm of the compromised cameras. "This one's independent," Annie said. "The vending company installed it after somebody kept breaking the coin slot." Edward looked at the camera, then at the hall behind them. "Does it record?" "I think so." "Can we access it?" "Not from here." The first man entered the corridor behind them. Edward pulled Annie behind the vending machine alcove just as the flashlight swept past. The man moved carefully, gun held low, not waving, not panicked. That told Edward enough. This was not some desperate amateur Richard had hired off a back alley. Whoever these men were, they had done controlled work before. The man's radio hissed. 84, I've got movement near West Service. Richard's voice came through faintly. Do not damage the drive. Annie's eyes flicked to Edward's jacket. The man stepped closer. Edward felt the security drive against his chest like a second heartbeat. Annie looked down at the vending machine. There was a plastic caution sign folded beside it, the kind janitors used for wet floors. She nudged it with her foot. It slid out into the corridor and tipped over with a slap. The man spun toward the sound. Edward and Annie slipped out the other side of the alcove and ducked into the employee break room. It was small, with 2 round tables, a microwave, a refrigerator covered in old magnets, and a bulletin board full of notices no executive would ever read. Union meeting, flu shots, lost gloves, church fundraiser, a flyer for discounted Cubs tickets. Annie moved straight to the back wall and opened a cabinet beneath the sink. Edward shut the door behind them. Tell me this room has another way out. It does if nobody fixed the thing they were supposed to fix. That sentence is becoming a theme tonight. Annie pulled out a loose panel under the sink. Behind it was a square opening into another utility crawl. Edward stared. How do you know all this? Annie gave him a look over her shoulder. Because when the day people break something, the night people learn how to work around it. The break room door handle moved. Edward helped her slide through the opening. This crawl space was lower than the last, but shorter. It led behind a line of restrooms and came out near a custodial closet on the east side of the floor. Annie pushed the exit panel open with her shoulder and dropped into the closet among mop heads, toilet paper cases, and cleaning chemicals. Edward came after her, landing awkwardly against a shelf. A bottle of disinfectant wobbled. Annie caught it before it fell. They both froze, listening. The hallway outside was quiet. Edward checked the phone. 1 bar. Not enough. Annie leaned against the shelf for 1 breath. For the first time, Edward noticed how young she looked when she was not moving. Her face had lost some of its color. A small cut crossed one knuckle where she had scraped it in the vent. You're hurt, he said. She looked at her hand. It's nothing. It's bleeding. It's not even enough to scare my mother. Edward took a folded handkerchief from his pocket. White, monogrammed, useless until now. He held it out. She hesitated. Take it, he said. I've ruined the suit already. She wrapped it around her knuckle. Thank you. No, thank you. The words came out quieter than he intended. Annie looked at him, and for a moment the tower seemed to shrink around something human instead of dangerous. Then his phone buzzed again. Richard Vale. Edward answered without speaking and tapped record. Richard did not wait. Edward, listen carefully. Police will arrive to a confused scene. You are wandering dark service floors with an hourly employee after a mechanical failure. If you hand over the drive, I can still frame this as panic, not incompetence. Edward leaned against the shelf. And Annie? A small pause. She will be treated generously, provided she cooperates. Annie watched Edward's face. What does cooperate mean? Edward asked. It means she says what happened. She startled you. You followed her. In the confusion, certain systems were misread. She heard your contractors discuss the VIP shaft. She heard maintenance jargon she didn't understand. She saw the elevator fall. So did you. And trauma affects perception. Edward's voice hardened. You're going to call her a liar. I'm going to call her 18, frightened, and in over her head. That is not the same thing. Annie closed her eyes for 1 second. Edward saw it and felt something in him settle into place. Her name is Annie Johnson, he said. You'd better remember it. Richard's voice cooled. You are risking everything for a girl who was polishing floors an hour ago. No, Edward said. I'm risking what's left of my pride because she was the only person in this tower who saw the truth before it killed me. Richard said nothing. Edward continued. You wanted me dead before the Singapore call. You wanted the drive. You used Linda's credentials, temporary contractors, and a sabotaged elevator. Now you're trying to buy her silence because you know the police will listen if she gives them details. That recording won't save you, Richard said. Edward glanced at Annie. She nodded once. Keep him talking. Maybe not, Edward said. But it will make an interesting start. Richard hung up. A second later, the building alarm finally began to sound. Not everywhere. Not cleanly. It stuttered through the walls, 1 floor at a time. A harsh mechanical pulse that meant Marcus Reed had restored enough backup power to force the tower to speak. Annie let out a breath. Edward said, Marcus, police will hear that from the street, Annie said. So will Vale. A voice shouted from somewhere down the hall. Alarms live, move now. Annie opened the custodial closet door a crack. Red light flashed across the empty corridor. "Where now?" Edward asked. She looked toward the far end of the hall, where a sign pointed to East Stair C. "If we go down, they expect it. If we go up, they won't. My office is compromised. I'm not taking you to your office." "Then where?" Annie swallowed, then pointed upward with the flashlight. "Insurance camera room. 85. Small closet behind the vending service office. It may have footage they don't control." Edward looked at her. She gave a tired half shrug. Somebody kept stealing Snickers. For the second time that night, the smallest people in Edward's building had built the only path toward justice. He nodded. "Lead the way." They moved toward East Stair C with the alarm stuttering through the walls. It did not sound like a clean evacuation alarm. It coughed, stopped, started again, then spread across the floor in uneven bursts. Somewhere in the building, Marcus Reed was forcing damaged systems to do their job with whatever power he had left. Edward could almost picture him in Security Room B, jaw tight, one hand on a dead console, refusing to let the tower stay silent. Annie opened the stairwell door an inch and listened. No voices. She slipped through first. Edward followed, keeping the door from clicking shut. The stairwell smelled of concrete, dust, and warm metal. Red emergency bulbs glowed at each landing. Far below, the alarm echoed upward in broken waves. "We go up one floor," Annie whispered. "Then, through the vending service office. If the insurance camera room is still locked, my badge might not open it. And if it doesn't, then we improvise." Edward glanced at the mop handle she still carried like a walking stick and a weapon. "You do that often?" "Every night." They climbed to 85. Edward's legs were beginning to feel the night now, not pain exactly, but the dull protest of a body that had spent the day in boardrooms and the last 30 minutes in ducts, ladders, and service shafts. Annie moved ahead of him with purpose, but he noticed her breathing had grown uneven too. At the 85th floor landing, she paused. Voices came from below. Not close, but rising. Edward leaned toward the stairwell center and heard a man say, "Vale wants the drive. Forget the girl unless she has it." Another voice answered, "Police are coming." "Then stop wasting time." Annie looked up at Edward. He saw the thought cross her face. They were beginning to separate his value from hers. The drive mattered. Edward mattered. Annie mattered only if she became inconvenient. He wanted to tell her that was not true, but it was true to the men hunting them, and pretending otherwise would be another kind of insult. He said instead, "Stay close." She nodded once. They entered the 85th floor. This level was not as polished as the executive floor above. It housed vendor offices, storage rooms, small administrative suites, and the kind of spaces that kept a tower functioning without appearing on brochures. The carpet was older, the ceiling lower, the air warmer. A sign on the wall pointed toward vending services and facilities support. Annie led him left. The vending service office sat behind a half-glass door with a company sticker peeling at one corner. The badge reader was dark. Annie tried her card anyway. Nothing. Edward took out his black executive card. Annie caught his wrist. "If the system is watching access attempts, don't." He stopped. "Right." She knelt by the door and ran her fingers beneath the frame. "The weekend vending guy keeps a spare key under here." Edward stared. "That is a security violation. That is a man who doesn't like walking back to his truck." She pulled free a small magnetic key box, opened it, and took out a brass key. The lock turned. Inside, the office was cramped and ordinary. A metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, a calendar with a picture of Lake Michigan, a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest, Dad." There was something painfully normal about it. Edward had spent his life in rooms designed to intimidate. This room was not trying to impress anyone. It simply held somebody's workday. Annie crossed to the back wall and opened a narrow door marked "Storage." Behind it was a closet half filled with replacement snack coils, boxes of chips, receipt paper, and a small black recording unit mounted above a shelf. "That it?" Edward asked. "I think so." The unit had its own battery light. Green. Annie let out a breath. "Thank God." Edward stepped closer. "Can we pull the footage?" "There's probably a memory card." She stood on a crate and reached for the unit, but it was mounted high. Edward moved beside her. "Careful," she said. If you yank it, we lose it. I am capable of removing a memory card. You didn't know where coffee comes from. He gave her a look, then carefully opened the side panel. Inside was a small SD card and a USB backup slot. Edward removed the card, then hesitated. This proves hallway movement near the vending area. It may not show the elevator. Annie pointed to the label on the unit. Camera 3, West Corridor. Camera 4, Service Hall. Camera 5, Vending Alcove. If the men passed through here or used the old routes, it caught them. Edward slipped the card into the small envelope from the safe and put it beside the security drive. Good. Annie opened a drawer and found a cheap USB stick with a vending company logo. Backup. Edward almost said they had enough. Then he remembered Richard's voice, Linda's texts, the way systems could be made to forget. Take it. Annie plugged the USB into the recording unit. A tiny screen lit up with file dates. She scrolled fast. There, she said. 6:22 p.m., 2 men entering service hall. Edward leaned closer. The grainy footage showed 2 men in maintenance uniforms walking through the 85th floor service corridor. One looked up toward the camera for less than a second. His badge was crooked. His boots were clean. One hand carried a black tool case. The other man held the door open with a temporary contractor card. Annie whispered, "That's them." Edward felt the last of his doubt die. Copy it. The progress bar crawled. 20%. From the hall outside came a door closing. Annie froze. Edward stepped to the office door and listened. Footsteps. 1 person, maybe 2. A woman's voice followed, low and controlled. He's not on 84. Check vendor offices. He may try for external cameras. Edward turned his head. Linda Shaw. Annie saw his face. Your assistant? Yes. The word came out flat. The copy bar reached 46%. Linda's voice came closer. Mr. Vale said no more delays. If Harrington has the drive, contain him. If the girl has any footage, take the device. Annie's fingers hovered over the USB. She knows. Edward whispered, keep copying. She's coming. Keep copying. The office door handle moved. Locked. Linda knocked once, soft and almost polite. Mr. Harrington, she called. Edward, it's Linda. I know you're frightened, but this is getting dangerous. Edward's eyes hardened. Annie's face twisted in disbelief. The woman sounded like a school principal coaxing a child out from under a desk. Linda continued, the police have been notified. Mr. Vale is trying to protect the company. Please don't let a temporary employee turn a terrible accident into something worse. Annie looked at Edward. Temporary employee. Edward reached for the phone, turned on recording again, and held it near the door. Linda, he said, how did you know I was alive? Silence. Then Linda said, everyone is trying to locate you. That is not an answer. Edward opened the door. How did you know Annie was with me? Another pause. The copy bar hit 78%. Linda's voice changed, less soft now. Because she clocked in on the floor. Because her cart was found near the elevator. Because this is not difficult to infer. Annie mouthed, Lee. Edward said, you used your credentials to reroute the alert. I did what Mr. Vale instructed during an emergency. The emergency began before the elevator fell. Linda did not answer. 92%. From farther down the hallway, a man said, move aside. Linda spoke quickly through the door. Edward, listen to me. Richard can still manage this. The board does not need to know how unstable this looked. Give me the drive, and I will make sure the girl is compensated. Edward glanced at Annie. Her jaw had set. What is her name, Linda? He asked. What? The girl. What is her name? Edward, this is not. You've seen her on this floor for months. What is her name? Silence. The copy reached 100%. Annie pulled the USB free. The hallway voice said, open it. Linda stepped away from the door. Edward put the phone in his pocket. Vent? Annie looked around. No, but there's a delivery hatch. Where? She pointed to a square pass-through behind stacked boxes of chips. For restocking from the service hall, Edward looked at the size of it. That is for potato chips. Then be thin. The lock beeped outside. Red. The man tried again. Red. Then came metal scraping against the doorframe. Annie shoved the boxes aside and opened the hatch. It led into a narrow, rolling shelf space that angled down behind the vending machines in the next corridor. She climbed in first. holding the USB between her teeth for 1 second while she got her grip. Edward followed, shoulders scraping both sides. Behind them, the office door burst open. "Storage!" Linda snapped. Edward pushed himself through the hatch, landing behind a row of vending machines with Annie beside him. On the other side of the wall, the men entered the storage closet. A voice shouted, "They took the card." Linda said something Edward could not hear. Then his phone vibrated again. A new message from Richard Vale. "You are running out of rooms." Annie looked at the screen, then down the corridor ahead. "No," she whispered. "He is." Edward followed her gaze. At the end of the hall, through a small wired glass window, blue and red lights flickered against the lower buildings outside. "Police! Police!" For 1 second, neither Edward nor Annie moved. The blue and red lights flashed against the glass of the building across the street, faint from 85 floors up but real. They were not inside yet. They were not close enough to save anyone. But the city had heard them. Annie's shoulders dropped a fraction, then tightened again. "Don't relax," she whispered. "I wasn't planning to." Behind the vending machines, the space was narrow and hot. Edward could hear Linda in the office they had just escaped, her voice sharpened by panic now. "They couldn't have gone far. Find the service exit." A man answered, "Police are outside." "Then move faster." Edward slipped the envelope with the SD card and the USB into his jacket beside the security drive. 3 pieces of proof now. Not enough for a trial by themselves, perhaps, but enough to break the story Richard intended to tell before sunrise. Annie pointed toward the far end of the vending corridor. "East stairwell is past that door. If we can reach 82, Marcus can get us to a secure line." Edward looked through the wired glass window again. Police lights shifted below, but no sirens reached this high through the sealed tower. "Vale will expect us to go down. He expected us to run. Then he expected your office. Then he expected the cameras. He's guessing because he lost control." Edward looked at her. "You sound sure." "I'm not. But my mother says when people chase you, don't run where they push you. Run where they're afraid you'll go." "And where is Vale afraid we'll go?" Annie looked at his jacket pocket. "Somewhere with enough signal to send that." Edward took out his phone. 1 bar flickered. The alarm pulsed unevenly through the ceiling. A message to Marcus might go through. A message to the police might not. A live upload could fail halfway and alert Richard's people to their location. He opened a secure email app, attached the audio file, the small data packet from the drive, and the copied video clip from the USB. The screen spun. No connection. Damn. Annie glanced at the phone. "Don't send everything. Send one thing first." "Which one?" His voice. Edward selected the recording of Richard's call, the part where he had said enough to tie himself to the Singapore deadline and the drive. He typed 3 recipients from memory. Marcus Reed, outside counsel, and a federal white-collar crimes contact he had not spoken to in years but whose number he kept because men like Edward never deleted useful doors. The upload crawled to 6%, then stopped. Footsteps sounded behind the vending machines. Annie pulled Edward down. A man entered the corridor, flashlight sweeping low. He was close enough that Edward could see the black soles of his shoes through the gap beneath the machine. The man stopped at the wired window, looked toward the police lights below, and spoke into his radio. "Cops are staging outside. We've got minutes." Richard's voice came back, thin through the radio. "Then recover the drive and clear the upper floors." "What about Harrington?" "Alive if he cooperates." "And the girl?" A pause. "Do not let her talk to police." Annie's face did not change, but Edward saw her hand close around the mop handle until her knuckles tightened. The man moved on. Edward looked at his phone. Upload failed. He wanted to throw the device through the wall. Annie touched his wrist. "Not here." The stairwell window at 80. 3 faces the street. Better signal. "How do you know that?" "I called my mom from there once when my train got canceled." They slipped out from behind the machines and moved toward the east stairwell. The hallway looked empty, but the tower no longer had empty places, only places not yet occupied. Edward held the phone low. Annie kept ahead of him, pausing at every corner. They reached the stairwell door. Before Annie opened it, Edward caught her sleeve. She turned. He said, "If something happens, you take the drive." "No." "Annie." "No. Don't do that rich man sacrifice speech. We both walk out." He almost smiled, but her face stopped him. All right, he said. We both walk out. They entered the stairwell. The sound changed at once. Concrete swallowed the alarm, turning it into a dull throb. Far below, a door slammed. Voices echoed upward. Not the hired men. Police voices, louder, organized, calling floor numbers. Edward leaned over the rail. Chicago Police, someone shouted from below. Building security. Identify yourself. Annie exhaled. They're inside. A shot of relief moved through Edward, but it died when another door opened above them. Linda Shaw stepped onto the landing at 86. She was still dressed as if she had just come from an executive dinner. Black coat, cream blouse, hair neat, badge clipped to her lapel. In the red stairwell light, her face looked pale but composed. She held no weapon. That made her more dangerous in a different way. Edward, she said, please stop. Annie moved slightly in front of him. Linda noticed and looked at her for the first time as if Annie were more than a problem in uniform. You have no idea what you're involved in, Linda said. Annie answered before Edward could. I know an elevator fell. Linda's mouth tightened. You heard things you didn't understand. I understood enough. Edward stepped beside Annie. Why, Linda? Linda looked at him then. And for a moment the assistant mask slipped. Because you stopped seeing the people holding the company together. Richard saw us. He knew what we were worth. He used you. You used everyone, she said. The words coming faster now. You call it discipline when people miss birthdays for your meetings. You call it loyalty when we answer your phone at midnight. You never ask what it costs. Edward did not defend himself. That would have been easier. He simply said, So you helped kill me? Linda flinched. It wasn't supposed to look like that. Annie stared at her. What was it supposed to look like? A malfunction? A tragedy? Linda's eyes flicked toward the stairs below, where the police voices were growing louder. Then stability. Richard would take control, the merger would close, the company would survive. And Mr. Harrington wouldn't, Annie said. Linda looked away. Edward felt the wound of it then, not because he loved Linda, but because he had believed efficiency was clean. Calendars, calls, closed doors, signed memos. Behind those things had been resentment, fear, money, and a woman who knew the minute he would step into an elevator. His phone buzzed. 1 bar. Then 2. Annie saw it. Now. Edward hit send again on the audio file. Linda saw his thumb move. No. She rushed down the steps. Not at Annie, but at Edward's phone. Annie stepped into her path and swung the mop handle low. Not to hurt her, just to block her legs. Linda stumbled, grabbed the rail, and Edward pulled Annie back. The upload hit 30%. Linda shouted down the stairwell. He's on 85 East Stairs. He has the drive. Above them, another door opened. A man's voice. Coming down. Below, police voices grew louder. Edward looked at the phone. 62%. Annie grabbed his arm. Move. They ran down the stairs toward 84. Linda followed. One hand on the rail, still shouting. From above came the heavy steps of one of Richard's men. From below came police boots climbing. The stairwell had become a vertical trap. At the 84th landing, Annie shoved the door open. It led into a short hallway ending at a glass-walled conference lounge. Police lights flashed outside now, brighter from this angle, bouncing off nearby towers. Edward's phone vibrated. Upload complete. A second later, Marcus Reed's name appeared. Incoming call. Edward answered. Marcus's voice came through, rough but alive. I got it. Police command got it too. Keep moving. Vale's trying to shut down upper access. I've got officers coming up west stairs, but east stairs are compromised. We noticed. You have Annie? Edward looked at her. Yes. Keep her with you. She's the clean witness. Annie heard that and frowned. Clean witness? Edward said. Meaning they can't tie you to Vale, Marcus continued. Go to 84 Conference Lounge. There's an exterior maintenance balcony behind the curtain wall. Fire rescue can see you from the street if you trigger the manual beacon. Edward looked across the room. How do I trigger it? You don't, Marcus said. Facilities keybox behind the north panel. Edward turned to Annie. She was already moving. I know where it is. Annie crossed the conference lounge without waiting for Edward. The room was meant for quiet deals and private celebrations, with a long glass table, leather chairs, a wall-mounted screen, and a view of Chicago that would have been beautiful on any other night. Now the city outside flashed blue and red against the windows, and the alarm stuttered through the ceiling like the tower was trying to speak with a broken mouth. Edward shut the stairwell door behind them and locked it from the inside. It would not hold long. From the other side, Linda's voice rose. Sharp now. Edward, open the door. You don't understand what Richard can still do. Edward ignored her. Annie reached the north wall and ran her hand along the dark wood paneling beneath a framed photograph of the tower's ribbon-cutting ceremony. Edward remembered that day. The mayor had been there. Cameras. Champagne. Richard Vale standing 2 steps behind him, smiling like a loyal man. Annie pressed a seam in the panel. Nothing happened. She tried again, lower. Come on, she whispered. Edward joined her. What are we looking for? Facilities key box, Marcus said, north panel. They hide emergency keys where executives won't see them. Linda pounded on the stairwell door. Edward. Above them, a heavier voice said, Move. Edward looked back. We don't have much time. I know. Annie moved to the next panel and pressed hard with the heel of her hand. A small square door popped open. Inside was a red metal box with a glass front and a simple latch. Edward reached for it. Annie caught his wrist. Wait. What? She pointed at a thin wire running from the latch to a small sensor. Alarm seal. The alarm is already going. Different alarm. Could lock the balcony door. Edward stepped back. Then how do we open it? Annie took the duct tape from her pocket, tore a strip with her teeth, and pressed it over the sensor arm. Then she lifted the latch slowly. The wire stayed in place. Edward watched her work with the focused patience of someone who had learned not from privilege but from having to make broken things function. His father had worked that way over engines, hands steady, eyes sharp, refusing to force apart until he understood why it resisted. The red box opened. Inside hung 3 keys, one marked beacon, one marked exterior access, and one marked rescue panel. Annie handed him the exterior access key. You're taller. Doors behind the curtain. Edward crossed to the window wall and pulled back a heavy gray curtain. Behind it was a narrow metal door he had never noticed in a room he had used for years. He fitted the key, turned it, and felt cold air push through the seam. The door opened onto a maintenance balcony no wider than a sidewalk curb. Wind struck him first, cold, high, and hard. The city roared below, though through the sealed glass it had been silent. Sirens rose from the street. Police lights washed the buildings beneath them. Far down, tiny figures moved near the base of Harrington Financial Tower. Edward stepped back. Annie, stay inside. She came to the door anyway and looked out. Where's the beacon? Marcus's voice was still on Edward's phone. Broken but audible. Beacon box should be left of the door. Waist height. Flip cover. Pull handle. Fire rescue will mark your location. Edward found it. A yellow box bolted to the exterior wall. He opened the cover and pulled the handle. Nothing. He pulled again. Still nothing. Marcus, he said into the phone. It's dead. Manual battery may be disconnected, Marcus answered. Panel below it. 2 clips. Edward crouched on the balcony. Wind snapped at his torn jacket. He opened the lower panel and found a loose battery pack hanging from 2 wires. Someone had pulled one connector free. Of course they had. He reattached it. The beacon burst to life. A sharp white strobe flashed against the side of the tower. Once. Twice. Then steady. In a repeating pulse. Below, voices shifted. A spotlight from the street climbed the building face, searching, then found them. For the first time since the elevator fell, someone outside the trap could see where they were. Annie let out a breath. Edward turned back toward her. Behind her, the stairwell door slammed. Once, twice. The lock began to bend. Inside, Edward said. Annie stepped back from the balcony door just as the conference lounge lights flickered. Not full power, a partial surge. The wall screen blinked on, then displayed a company logo before dissolving into static. Edward's phone crackled. Marcus said, Fire rescue has visual. Hold position if you can. Officers are moving up West Stair. Do not let Vale's people push you back into the interior corridors. The stairwell door slammed again. A man's voice shouted, Open it. Linda's voice followed, strained. Edward, please. You are making this worse for everyone. Annie looked at Edward. She keeps saying that because she needs me to believe it. Do you? He looked at the bent door, the strobing beacon, the city below, then at the 18-year-old woman who had dragged him out of death by the sleeve. No. The door gave way. It did not fly open. It bent inward first, then broke around the lock. Linda stumbled in, followed by one of the fake maintenance men, the one with the clean boots and the black tool case. He had a gun held low, angled toward the floor but ready. Edward stepped in front of Annie. The man raised the gun slightly. Linda saw the beacon flashing outside and went pale. You triggered it, Edward said. Police already have the recording. Linda's eyes flicked to his jacket. Then give me the drive. If the file is already sent, you don't need it. Annie spoke from behind Edward. That's not how evidence works. The man with the gun looked at her. Quiet. Edward's voice cut in. You don't talk to her. The man smiled a little. You're not in a position to give instructions. No, Edward said, but the police outside are. The man's jaw tightened. He could hear the sirens. He could see the strobe. He knew time was shrinking. Linda took a step forward, palms raised. Edward, listen. Richard can still say this was confusion. He can say contractors panicked after the accident. He can protect the company from a public collapse. But if that drive goes to police, everything goes down. Pension funds, employees, your name. My name was already on the elevator. That was Richard, and you gave him the time. Linda's face tightened, Edward said. You knew I would leave after the Singapore prep call. You knew I would use the VIP elevator. You sent the message telling me to stay where I was after the crash, before you should have known I survived. You rerouted the alert. Linda swallowed. I did what I thought was necessary. For money? For survival, she snapped, and for the first time all the polish left her. You have no idea what it's like to build your life around someone else's power. You walk into rooms and people stand. The rest of us learn which door to use and when to disappear, Annie said quietly. Some of us disappear without trying to kill anybody. Linda turned on her. You think this makes you noble? You think he'll remember you after the cameras leave? Edward did not let Annie answer. I will, he said. Linda laughed once, bitter and small. You don't even know the names of half the people who keep this building alive. I know hers. The room went still around that. The man with the gun shifted. Enough. He stepped forward. At the same moment, the balcony spotlight brightened. A voice boomed from outside, through a police loudspeaker far below. Distorted by height, but clear enough. Occupants on the 84th floor balcony, move away from the armed suspect. Police are entering the floor. The gunman flinched toward the window. Annie moved. She did not attack him. She did what she knew. She grabbed the wet floor sign, folded near the service cart beside the lounge entrance, and kicked it open across the polished floor. It slid under the man's front foot just as he shifted his weight. He slipped. Not far, not dramatically. Just enough. Edward drove his shoulder into him, knocking the gun arm sideways. The weapon struck the glass table and skidded across it. Linda screamed and stumbled back. Annie grabbed the gun with both hands, not lifting it, just shoving it farther across the table until it dropped behind the chairs, out of reach. The gunman lunged. The conference lounge door burst open from the west corridor. Chicago police. Hands where I can see them. Officer Daniel Brooks came in first, weapon raised, 2 officers behind him. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the flat, steady voice of a man who had learned that panic made bad rooms worse. The gunman froze. Down, Brooks ordered. The man lowered himself to the floor. Linda stood motionless, hands half raised, face empty with shock. Edward stepped away from the gunman, breathing hard. Annie backed toward the wall, still holding the USB so tightly that her fingers shook. Officer Brooks looked from Edward to Annie, then to the beacon flashing outside. Who called 911? Annie opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Edward answered. She did. Brooks turned to her, not dismissing her, not looking past her uniform. Your name? Annie swallowed. Annie Johnson. Brooks nodded once. Miss Johnson, are you hurt? The question almost undid her. She looked at the handkerchief wrapped around her knuckle, then at Edward. No, sir, she said. Not badly. Brooks lowered his voice a fraction. All right. Stay with me. Tell me where the evidence is. Edward reached into his jacket and took out the security drive. Annie lifted the USB. Then Edward said, "And there's a recording already sent to Marcus Reed and Police Command." Brooks looked at Linda. "Good." From the hallway, another officer called out, "We have Vale contained on 12. Attempting data wipe." Edward closed his eyes for 1 second. Not relief. Not yet. Annie stepped closer and said, "Mr. Harrington?" He opened his eyes. She held out his monogrammed handkerchief, stained now with a small line of blood from her knuckle. "I think this is yours." Edward looked at it, then at her. "No," he said softly. "Keep it." For the first time that night, Annie almost smiled. Then Officer Brooks guided them away from the balcony door, past Linda Shaw, past the broken lock, past the table where the gun had fallen, and into the corridor filling now with police radios, heavy boots, and the sound of the tower finally being taken back. Officer Brooks moved them into a side corridor away from the broken conference lounge. The hallway was no longer silent. Police radios crackled. Firefighters called floor numbers through masks. Somewhere below, the alarm still pulsed unevenly, but now it sounded less like a warning and more like a building waking up after being held down too long. Edward walked beside Annie, one hand still inside his jacket where the drive had been. His fingers closed on nothing before he remembered he had handed it to Brooks. That absence bothered him. For years, evidence, leverage, contracts, signatures, numbers, all of it had stayed under his control until he decided otherwise. Now the most important thing in his life was in the hands of a police officer he had met 60 seconds ago. Annie noticed. "You gave it to the right person," she said. Edward looked at her. "You don't know that." He asked my name first. That stopped him. Brooks led them into a smaller meeting room on the same floor, one with no balcony and only one door. 2 officers stood outside. A firefighter checked the air vent, then nodded and left. The room had a table, 6 chairs, a dead screen on one wall, and a coffee station with paper cups stacked too neatly. "Sit if you need to," Brooks said. Annie stayed standing. Edward did too. Brooks looked at both of them with the patience of a man who had seen pride wear many kinds of clothing. That wasn't a suggestion for weakness. It was a suggestion for blood pressure. Annie sat first, mostly because her knees chose for her. Edward sat beside her. Brooks set the security drive, the SD card, and the USB into separate evidence bags. He wrote the time, floor, and names on each with a black marker. Annie watched every movement. "You're going to keep those together?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Brooks said. "We're going to log them separately so nobody can say one device contaminated the other." Annie nodded. "Good." Edward looked at her. She caught him looking. "What?" "Nothing." "No, say it." He almost said, "You keep surprising me." But that sounded too much like the old version of himself. The one who thought surprise was a compliment, when it only proved he had not been paying attention. So he said, "You're right to watch the evidence." Brooks glanced up. "She is." That small agreement did something to Annie's face. She lowered her eyes quickly, but Edward saw it. The relief of being believed could be as strong as fear when someone had gone too long without it. A radio clipped to Brooks's shoulder burst to life. "Brooks, we have Vale in custody on 12. Digital forensics requested. Suspect was at terminal attempting wipe. 1 female assistant detained on 84. 2 contractor suspects secured. Searching for third." Brooks pressed the button. "Copy. Keep Vale separated from Shaw and contractors. No shared transport. No hallway conversations." Edward said, "There may be a third man. We're treating it that way." Annie leaned forward. "One of them had a crooked badge and clean boots. The other had glue where his name patch should be. The one near the elevator said the cable system wouldn't argue after midnight. I can identify them if I see them." Brooks wrote that down. "We'll do it properly. Not tonight in a hallway. You'll give a statement, then later a formal identification with counsel present if needed." Edward frowned. "Counsel?" Brooks looked at him. "She's a witness in a murder attempt involving a billionaire, corporate officers, sabotaged infrastructure, and possible financial fraud. She should not be standing alone in the middle of that." Annie's back straightened. "I don't have a lawyer." "You do now," Edward said. She turned toward him. "Mr. Harrington, that is not charity. That is protection. I don't want anyone speaking over me. Then they won't. I'll pay for someone whose job is to make sure no one does." Brooks studied Edward for a second. as if measuring whether the offer had strings. Annie did the same. Edward understood and added, "You choose the lawyer. I pay the invoice. That's all." Annie looked away. "We'll talk about it after my mother knows I'm alive." The word mother seemed to return the room to its human size. "Call her," Edward said. "My phone's dead." Edward held out his. "Use mine." Annie took it carefully, as if phones like his had rules. Her fingers moved to the keypad, then stopped. "What time is it?" Edward checked the corner of the screen. 1:17. Annie closed her eyes for a moment. "She's on break at the hospital around now." She dialed. The call rang twice. "Hello?" Grace Johnson's voice came through tight with exhaustion and caution. "Mom." There was a silence so short it almost was not one. "Annie? Baby, whose phone is this? Are you all right?" Annie tried to answer like she had answered 911, clear and useful, but her voice broke on the first word. "I'm okay." Grace knew immediately that okay meant something had happened. "Where are you?" "At the tower. I'm with the police. I'm safe." Edward looked down at the table. Safe sounded too small for what she had done. Grace's voice sharpened. "What happened?" Annie glanced at Brooks, then Edward. "There was an elevator accident." "Not accident. I stopped Mr. Harrington from getting in. Some men were trying to hurt him." "What men?" "I don't know yet. Police are here." "Annie Johnson, you listen to me. Do not sign anything. Do not let anybody rush you. Do not let them call you confused." Annie's eyes filled, but she smiled through it. "I know, Mom." Edward heard that and felt shame move through him. Grace Johnson had known exactly what the world might do to her daughter before Edward had even recognized it. Annie handed the phone to Brooks at his request. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Officer Daniel Brooks, Chicago Police. Your daughter is safe with us. She is a key witness, and she appears to have saved a man's life tonight. We can have an officer bring you to the building or meet you at the station." Grace's voice changed, steadier now but still afraid. "I'm coming myself." "Ma'am, downtown access is blocked." "I said I'm coming." Brooks paused. "Understood. I'll have an officer meet you at the south barricade." He handed the phone back. Annie whispered, "I'm sorry." Grace said, "For being brave? Don't you dare apologize for that. I'm on my way." The call ended. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the door opened and Marcus Reed entered with 2 officers behind him. He looked older than Edward remembered from that morning. His jacket was wrinkled, one sleeve torn, and there was a red mark across his cheek, where someone had shoved him against something. But he was upright. Edward stood. "Marcus." Marcus gave a tired nod. "You look terrible." "So do you." "Mine's honest work." Annie watched the 2 men, unsure whether they were joking. Marcus turned to her. "You Annie Johnson?" "Yes, sir." He extended his hand. "Marcus Reed, I owe you more than a handshake, but it's what I've got right now." Annie shook it. Marcus did not squeeze too hard. He did not make a speech. That made it better. He looked at Edward. "Vale's already asking for counsel. Says he was managing a security crisis from 12. Brooks said, "The recording says otherwise." Marcus nodded. "And the drive will say more. Preliminary logs show Linda Shaw's credentials rerouted the elevator alert at 11:42, 6 minutes before the fall. Temporary contractor IDs entered the VIP shaft at 6:18 p.m. Executive override came from Vale's office." Edward felt the facts settle into place with a weight that was almost physical. Annie said quietly, "So I did hear it right." Marcus looked at her. "You heard it exactly right." The room shifted again. Annie looked down at the handkerchief around her knuckle. Edward wanted to say something, but words felt cheap beside proof. Brooks's radio crackled once more. "Brooks, media's gathering outside. Building ownership rep is requesting statement." Edward let out a bitter breath. "Ownership rep?" Marcus said. "That would normally be you." Edward looked at Annie. Then at the evidence bags. Then at the door beyond which Richard Vale's version of the night was already trying to be born. "No statement without her name," he said. Annie looked up. "My name?" "Yes," Edward said. "Not a cleaning girl, not an employee. Annie Johnson." Brooks nodded once. "That can wait until she's ready." Edward accepted the correction. "Until she's ready." Annie studied him, still wary, but less alone than before. Outside the room, the tower filled with voices, radios, footsteps. and the first machinery of justice. It would not be clean. It would not be quick. Men like Richard Vale did not build schemes without building exits. But for the first time that night, Edward understood that surviving was not the same as winning. Winning would mean making sure the truth did not get polished down until Annie disappeared from it. He looked at her and said, "When your mother gets here, I'd like to thank her." Annie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. For what? For raising someone who kept her eyes open? Annie did not smile this time. She only nodded, as if that was a debt she would allow him to recognize but not own. Grace Johnson reached the south barricade at 1:43 inches the morning. She came in hospital scrubs with a winter coat thrown over them, her badge still clipped to her chest, her hair pulled back the way nurses wore it when there had been no time to care about anything except getting through the shift. A young officer tried to ask her to wait behind the tape until someone could confirm her name. Grace looked at him once. "My daughter is in that building." The officer stepped aside. Annie saw her through the glass doors of the side entrance on the 84th floor feed, where police had routed families and key personnel through a secured service lobby. For a moment, Annie stayed in the meeting room chair, both hands flat on the table, as if standing too fast might make the night fall apart again. Then she rose. Edward stood too, but Marcus touched his arm. "Let her go first." Edward stopped. Annie walked out into the corridor. Grace came through the security doors at the far end, following Officer Brooks. She moved fast until she saw Annie. Then her whole body changed. The nurse disappeared. The woman who had spent years holding herself steady for patients, bills, double shifts, and bad news finally let fear show. "Annie, Mum." Grace pulled her into her arms so hard Annie made a small sound. Half laugh, half sob. For the first time all night, Annie looked 18. Not the witness. Not the girl who knew the hidden corridors. Not the one who spoke clearly to 911 while men hunted her through the dark. Just a daughter with her face pressed against her mother's shoulder. Grace held the back of Annie's head. "I told you to keep your eyes open. Not go saving billionaires in the middle of the night." Annie laughed through a breath she had been holding since the elevator fell. "I didn't plan it. You never plan the things that scare a mother gray." "I'm okay." Grace pulled back and looked at her hand, the monogrammed handkerchief wrapped around her knuckle. "That is not okay. It's small. That's what people say before nurses make them sit down." Officer Brooks waited a respectful distance away. Edward stood farther back with Marcus, giving them room. He had watched hundreds of negotiations in silence, but this silence felt different. It was not strategy. It was respect. Grace noticed him anyway. Her eyes moved from his torn suit to his bruised shoulder, then to his face. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Chicago who watched the news knew Edward Harrington, but she did not look impressed. She walked toward him with Annie beside her. Edward straightened, not in the way he did before a board vote, in the way a man stands when he owes someone more than a check. "Mrs. Johnson," he said. Grace's expression did not soften. "Mr. Harrington, your daughter saved my life. So, I've been told. I would not be standing here without her." Grace looked at Annie, then back at him. "Then make sure the story says that." Edward accepted the blow because it was deserved. "It will." Grace held his gaze. "No, sir. I don't mean a polite sentence at a press conference. I mean when lawyers start cleaning things up. When men in nice coats start saying misunderstanding and confusion and young employee. I mean when people get tired of hearing the truth because it makes the powerful look careless." Edward said nothing. Grace continued, lower now. "My daughter's name is Annie Johnson. She is not a footnote in what happened to you." Annie shifted beside her. "Mom, no, baby. Let me say it once while everybody in this expensive hallway can hear me." Marcus looked down, hiding the smallest smile. Officer Brooks did not hide his. "Mrs. Johnson is making a valid point." Edward nodded. "She is." Grace folded her arms. "Good. Then remember it." Before Edward could answer, Brooks's radio crackled. "Brooks, command wants Harrington downstairs for preliminary statement. Media's multiplying. Federal liaison en route. Vale's attorney just arrived." Edward's jaw tightened. "Already?" Marcus said. "Men like Vale keep lawyers closer than friends." Annie looked toward the windows. Down on the street, news vans had joined the police lights. Even from 84 floors up, Their satellite masts looked like insects gathering around heat. Grace saw Annie looking. "You don't have to talk to cameras tonight." Brooks said, "Correct. She gives a protected witness statement first. No media, unless she chooses." Edward turned to Annie. "You decide." Annie studied him, searching for the old command in his voice. She did not find it. "I'll give the police statement," she said. "Not cameras." "Not yet." "Good," Grace said. A detective from Financial Crimes arrived 10 minutes later with a federal liaison, a woman named Karen Holt, who wore a plain navy coat and carried herself like she had no patience for corporate fog. She listened while Brooks summarized the evidence. The sabotaged elevator, the 911 call, the recording of Richard Vale, Linda's credential use, the temporary contractor IDs, the vending camera footage, Marcus's logs, and Edward's standalone security drive. Holt turned to Annie first. "Miss Johnson, Officer Brooks says you heard the suspects earlier this evening." "Yes, ma'am." "Can you repeat the words as closely as possible?" Annie took a breath. Grace stood beside her, one hand resting lightly against the back of her chair, not pushing, just there. One said, "The VIP shaft's been handled. Cable system won't argue after midnight." The other said, "As long as Harrington takes his usual ride down." Holt wrote it down without changing her expression. "You told anyone before the elevator fell?" "No, I didn't know what it meant." "Then what made you stop Mr. Harrington?" The elevator sounded wrong. The chime was lower than usual. The cabin lights flickered in a pattern. Short, long, short. Same rhythm as some of the cameras later. Holt looked up. "You noticed the pattern?" "Yes, ma'am." Edward watched Holt write that too. Not girl panicked. Not cleaner imagined. Pattern noticed. For the first time, he understood the power of a record made by someone who was willing to listen. Holt turned to Edward. "Mr. Harrington, we'll need a full statement, but first answer this plainly. Did Miss Johnson prevent you from entering the elevator?" "Yes." "Would you have entered if she had not physically stopped you?" Edward looked at Annie. "Yes." "Did you initially believe her?" "No." Grace's eyes flicked to him. Edward did not hide from it. "I threatened to have her removed by security." Holt wrote that down. Annie looked at him, surprised he had said it without softening the edges. Edward continued, "I was wrong." No one spoke for a moment. Then Marcus's radio crackled again. "Reed, you need to hear this. Vale is claiming Harrington staged part of the incident to block the Singapore execution and avoid board exposure." Marcus swore softly. Edward's face went cold. "He's already pivoting." Holt did not look surprised. "Of course he is." Annie frowned. "What does that mean?" Edward answered before Holt could. "It means he's trying to make the truth look like a business fight." Grace said, "That man tried to kill you and now he's calling it paperwork?" "In my world," Edward said, "paperwork has killed more people than most weapons." Holt closed her notebook. "Then we move faster." "Mr. Harrington, can Vale still trigger the Singapore signing?" Edward checked his watch. "It's 1:58. The call is in 2 minutes." Marcus said, "If Vale had a proxy mechanism ready, someone could still try to execute from an outside terminal." Edward's phone buzzed. This time it was not Richard. It was an encrypted calendar alert. "Singapore closing window open." Edward looked at Holt, then Marcus. "I need a secure line." Grace tightened her hand on Annie's chair. "You are not going anywhere alone." Edward looked at Annie. "No, not alone." Holt pointed to a police tech officer in the hall. "Set up a monitored line here. Record everything. No one uses building systems." The next 3 minutes moved with controlled urgency. A police laptop was placed on the conference table. Marcus connected the standalone drive through a forensic adapter. Edward logged into the secure acquisition portal while Holt watched. Annie sat beside Grace, hands clasped, trying to follow numbers and terms moving across the screen faster than ordinary speech. A window opened. Richard Vale's proxy authorization was already pending. Edward's expression hardened. He cued it. Holt leaned in. "Can you stop it?" "Yes." He entered a command, then paused. The screen asked for secondary verification. Linda Shaw's name appeared as pending executive witness. Edward gave a short, bitter laugh. She was ready for this. Marcus said, "Can you override?" "With board founder authority and security challenge." "Do it." Edward typed. The system asked a personal challenge question created 20 years earlier. Name of first employer. For the first time that night, Edward hesitated. Annie saw his face change. What? He looked at the prompt as if it had opened a door he had kept locked. My father's garage. Grace, standing behind Annie, said quietly, then type it. Edward entered. Harrington Auto Repair. The system accepted. He canceled Richard's proxy, froze the acquisition execution, and triggered an emergency board fraud hold that could not be lifted for 72 hours without federal review. The confirmation appeared on screen at 2:03 a.m. No one cheered. The room simply exhaled. Holt said, "That gives us time." Edward sat back. The billionaire, the man who had built the tower, looked suddenly older than 50. Annie looked at him. Is it over? He turned from the screen to the evidence bags, to Marcus, to Grace, to the police lights still flashing outside. No, he said, but he doesn't get to write the ending before morning. Grace nodded once. That'll do for tonight. Edward looked at Annie then, and his voice dropped. You saved more than my life. Annie shook her head. I just heard something wrong. No, Edward said. You listened when every part of this building was designed to make you ignore it. Annie did not answer. Outside, down on the street, the first reporters began speaking into cameras, trying to name a story they did not yet understand. Inside, on the 84th floor, Annie Johnson's statement was being written into the record before anyone could erase her from it. By 2:20 a.m., Harrington Financial Tower no longer belonged to Richard Vail. That was the first thing Edward noticed. Not because his name had been taken off the wall, or because the company had changed hands, but because the hallways no longer obeyed the wrong people. Police officers stood at the doors. Firefighters controlled the elevators that still worked. Federal technicians photographed access panels, badge readers, maintenance locks, and the open VIP shaft where the executive elevator should have been. Men and women with evidence bags moved through the building with a patience Edward had once mistaken for slowness. Now he understood it as care. Officer Brooks walked Annie and Grace to a quieter room on the 83rd floor, away from the windows and the reporters gathering below. Edward stayed behind with Marcus and Karen Holt, while a police photographer documented his torn jacket, the dust on his sleeves, the scraped leather on his shoes, the place where Annie's hand had wrinkled the fabric near his cuff. The photographer looked up. We need the jacket bagged. Edward glanced down at it. For most of his adult life, clothes had been armor. Tailored suits, polished shoes, the right watch, the right tie. They told rooms what to expect from him before he said a word. This jacket had cost $7,000 and was now ripped at the shoulder, stained with dust, and creased where an 18-year-old girl had stopped him from dying. He took it off slowly and handed it over. Marcus watched him. You all right? Edward almost gave the automatic answer. Fine. But the word would have been useless in that hallway. No, he said. Marcus nodded as if that was the first sensible thing Edward had said all night. Across the corridor, 2 officers escorted Linda Shaw past them. Her hands were cuffed in front, her hair no longer neat, her cream blouse marked with dust from the stairwell. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at Edward. For a moment, he saw the woman who had stood outside his office for 9 years, who knew when to hold calls, when to cancel meetings, when to place black coffee on his desk without asking. Then he saw the texts, the rerouted alert, the elevator, Annie being described as a temporary employee who could be managed. Edward, Linda said. The officers slowed but did not stop. I did not think they would really let it fall with you inside. Edward looked at her. That is your defense? Her mouth trembled. Richard said the system would stop it before impact. He said it would frighten you, delay you, force a medical leave. He said whatever you needed to hear. Linda's face collapsed inward, but only for a second. You never listened to any of us. Edward was tired enough to answer honestly. That may be true. She blinked, surprised. But you still chose this, he said. The officers led her away. Marcus let out a slow breath. That'll come back in court. It should. Karen Holt came over with a tablet in hand. Vail is asking to speak with you. No. He says he'll provide names of the outside parties if you meet him privately. No. Holt's eyes approved before her mouth did. Good. I told him the same thing. Edward looked toward the elevators, where crime scene tape blocked the VIP bank. Where is he? 12th floor conference suite. Cuffed. Loud. Expensive lawyer on speaker. Marcus snorted. Sounds like Richard. Holt lowered her voice. We have the drive. We have the recording. We have the vending footage. We have Marcus's logs and the proxy attempt. It is enough to hold him. The rest will take time. Edward nodded. Time. That was something Richard had tried to steal. The 3 seconds before the elevator fell, the minutes before the Singapore call, the hours before morning headlines shaped public memory. Now time was working against him. Edward turned. Where's Annie? With her mother. Brooks is taking her preliminary statement. She needs counsel. I heard you offered. She chooses. I pay. Holt studied him. Make sure that remains exactly what it is. Help, not ownership. Edward accepted the warning. I understand. Do you? He looked through the glass wall toward the city. Dawn was still hours away, but the black had softened at the edge of the skyline. I'm starting to. Brooks found him 20 minutes later. Miss Johnson finished the first statement, he said. Clear, consistent, detailed. Her mother wants her checked by paramedics before anyone asks another question. She should be. She asked whether you were alive before she agreed to sit down. Edward looked at him. Brooks added, That's not a question I'd take lightly. No. Come on. She'll want to see you before they take her downstairs. The room on 83 was smaller than the others, with beige walls and a table marked by old coffee rings. Annie sat beside Grace, a blanket around her shoulders, a paramedic wrapping her scraped knuckle properly. The monogrammed handkerchief lay folded on the table beside her phone. Grace looked up first. Mr. Harrington. Mrs. Johnson. Annie's eyes moved to his shirt sleeves. They took your jacket. Evidence. It was already ruined. So was my evening. She gave a tired laugh, small but real. Grace looked between them, still wary but no longer hostile. Edward stood across the table, not sitting until Grace nodded toward the empty chair. He sat. I wanted to tell you both, he said. Richard Vale has been detained. Linda Shaw, too. 2 of the men posing as maintenance are in custody. Police are still looking for a possible third. Annie absorbed that. And the elevator? Crime scene. No one will touch it except investigators. Grace said, Good. Annie looked down at her bandaged hand. He said they would call me confused. Edward's jaw tightened. They won't get to do that. Grace leaned back. They'll try. Yes, Edward said. They will. Annie looked up. He continued. And when they do, the record will show your 911 call, your statement, the footage you found, and the fact that I am alive because you stopped me. Grace watched him closely. And when your company's people want to make it sound cleaner? Edward did not look away. I won't let them. You can't promise the whole world, Mr. Harrington. No, he said. But I can promise what leaves my mouth. That satisfied her more than a grand vow would have. Marcus entered, holding a paper cup of vending machine coffee like it had offended him personally. Media's getting worse. Board members are calling every number they have. One of them tried to tell command he outranks the police. Brooks smiled without humor. He learned otherwise. Edward rubbed a hand over his face. They'll need a statement before the market opens. Grace's expression sharpened. Annie is not going in front of cameras at this hour. No, Edward said. I am. Annie frowned. You just said my name should be in it. It will be. But you don't owe the public your face tonight. Grace nodded once. That's right. Edward looked at Annie. I will say only what is already on record. That an employee named Annie Johnson stopped me from entering the elevator. That her observations gave police critical information. That the investigation is ongoing. Nothing more without your consent. Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Don't call me brave like that explains everything. Edward paused. I was scared, she said. The whole time. Brooks leaned against the wall. Brave usually means scared and moving anyway. Annie looked at him, then at Edward. Say I paid attention. Edward nodded. I can say that. Downstairs in the lobby that had been sealed off with tape and police lines, Edward gave his statement at 3:12 a.m. He stood without his jacket, sleeves dusty, tie gone, face drawn under the hard lights of the press cameras. Marcus stood behind him. Karen Holt stood off to the side. Officer Brooks remained near the interior doors. Reporters shouted over one another. Mr. Harrington, was this an assassination attempt? Is Richard Vale involved? Did the Singapore deal collapse? Who was the cleaning girl? Edward raised one hand. The room settled enough. At approximately 11:48 tonight, he said, the executive elevator in this building suffered a catastrophic failure. I was not inside it because Annie Johnson, a night shift employee in this tower, stopped me from entering. Cameras clicked. Edward continued. She noticed irregularities others missed. She heard information earlier in the day that she had the courage to repeat, even when I did not immediately listen. Her name is Annie Johnson. She is not the cleaning girl in this story. She is the reason I am alive. A reporter called out, "Is she here? She is safe, and she will not be answering questions tonight. Was this connected to your merger? That is under investigation. I have turned over evidence to law enforcement and federal authorities. Harrington Capital will cooperate fully. Did someone inside your company betray you?" Edward paused. For 1 second. Cameras, microphones, police lights, and the whole machinery of public judgment waited for him. "Yes," he said, "and someone invisible to that same company saved me." He stepped away before they could pull him into speculation. Upstairs, Annie watched on a muted screen beside her mother. Grace crossed her arms. "He said your name right." Annie nodded. On the screen, Edward disappeared into the building again, no longer looking like the untouchable man from the framed lobby photograph. Annie looked at the bandage on her hand, then at the skyline beyond the glass. The night was not over. Statements, lawyers, hearings, headlines, all of that waited. But somewhere below, the story had begun with her name intact. 3 months later, the executive elevator opened with a clean, even chime. Ting. Annie Johnson stopped before the silver doors and listened. Not because she was afraid. Not exactly. Fear had changed shape since that night. It no longer ran through her like panic. It sat quietly in the back of her mind, reminding her to notice things. The sound of a motor. The rhythm of a light. The way a person smiled when they wanted something hidden. The chime sounded right. The cabin lights were steady. The doors opened all the way and stayed open. Edward Harrington stood inside, one hand resting against the rail. He wore a dark suit, but not the kind that looked like armor. No tie. No polished distance. The left sleeve of his jacket had been tailored slightly different from the right because his shoulder still bothered him when it rained. He looked at Annie and waited. She had not come in through the employee entrance that morning. She had walked through the front lobby of Harrington Financial Tower in a navy blazer, white blouse, gray slacks, and low black shoes she had bought with her mother after arguing for 20 minutes over price. Around her neck was a visitor badge that read, Annie Johnson, Executive Internship Program. Not temporary employee, not cleaning girl. Her name, still. She had paused near the lobby's west wall when she saw a custodian pushing a cart near the reception desk. The woman was older, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair tucked under a black cap. Annie stepped aside, smiled, and said, "Morning, ma'am." The woman looked surprised, then smiled back. "Morning, baby." Edward had seen it from near the elevators but said nothing. He was learning there were moments a man should not enter just because he had the power to. Now Annie stood before the elevator that had once nearly killed him. "Safe?" he asked. She tilted her head, listening one more second. "Now it is." They stepped in together. The doors closed, and for the first time since that night, Edward did not feel the old certainty that machines obeyed because money had paid for them to obey. He felt trust, which was different and much harder earned. "You don't have to use this elevator today," he said. "I know. We could take another one. I know. Or the stairs." Annie looked at him. 8 floors? I was being supportive. You were being dramatic. Edward smiled. Fair. The elevator began to rise. For a few floors, neither of them spoke. Chicago moved behind the glass panel beside them. Morning light sliding over the river and the roofs below. Annie held a leather folder against her chest. Inside were her internship papers, her fall tuition confirmation, and a letter from Westlake Community College, stating that her account had been paid in full through graduation. Edward had not handed her a check in front of cameras. Grace Johnson had made sure of that. The first meeting after the investigation began had taken place not in a boardroom, but in a diner near Mercy General, where Grace ordered black coffee, Annie ordered pancakes, and Edward sat across from them looking out of place among vinyl booths and old men reading newspapers. He had offered the scholarship there, quietly. Grace had asked, "What do you want in return?" Edward had answered, "Nothing." Grace had stared at him until he corrected himself. "That's not true. I want her to have the choice to walk into rooms men like Richard Vale never wanted her in." Annie had said, "Then don't just give me a seat. Let me learn enough to change the table." Edward had remembered that sentence. He had repeated it to the board 2 weeks later, when announcing the new internship and mentorship fund for night staff, hourly workers, and their children. Some directors called it sentimental. Edward called it overdue. The elevator passed the 40th floor. Annie glanced at him. "You're quiet." "I was thinking. That sounds expensive." "It usually is." She smiled faintly. The last 3 months had not been clean. Richard Vale's lawyers tried to turn the night into a corporate dispute. Linda Shaw's attorneys argued pressure, manipulation, fear. The 2 fake maintenance contractors named an outside competitor, then changed their statements twice. Federal investigators dug through accounts, shell companies, private messages, and the Singapore deal. The news cycle tried to make Annie a symbol before she had time to be a person. Some headlines called her a hero. Some called her lucky. A few called her opportunistic. Grace Johnson had read one of those aloud at the kitchen table, folded the paper neatly, and said, "People who weren't there always know the most." Annie stopped reading after that. Edward did not. He read every word. Not because they were true, but because he wanted to know how easily truth could be bent when powerful people applied pressure. The elevator slowed near the 88th floor. Edward turned to Annie. "There's something I want you to see before orientation." The doors opened. The VIP floor looked different now. Some changes were visible. New cameras, new access panels, a permanent security station near the executive corridor, emergency lights tested twice a week. Other changes were quieter. Service doors had signs now. Staff routes had maps. Cleaning crews had direct emergency contacts that did not run through executive offices. Marcus Reed had insisted on that. Edward had agreed before Marcus finished the sentence. Annie stepped out. For a second, her eyes went to the spot near the elevator where her mop had hit the marble that night. Edward saw it. "We replaced the floor panel," he said. "There was a crack. I remember. I kept the old one." She looked at him. "Why?" He led her toward the wall near the elevator bank. A small bronze plaque had been mounted there, plain and level, not large enough to turn her into decoration, not small enough to ignore. In honor of Annie Johnson, for paying attention when power almost didn't. Annie read it once, then again. Her throat tightened. Edward stood a step behind her, giving her room. "I asked your mother before installing it," he said. "That sounds like her. She made me change the first version." "What did it say?" He hesitated. "For courage." Annie laughed softly, though her eyes were wet. "She said I'd hate that. She said you would say courage makes it sound like you weren't scared." Annie touched the edge of the plaque with 2 fingers. "I was scared." "I know." "No," she said, turning to him. "I need people to know that. I don't want some little girl hearing the story and thinking brave people don't shake." I shook the whole time. Edward nodded. "Then we'll tell it that way." She looked back at the words. "For paying attention." That was better. That was something a person could choose. Marcus Reed came from the security desk, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "Look who made it to the top floor without crawling through a wall." Annie smiled. "Morning, Mr. Reed." "Marcus," he said. "After what happened, I think we're past Mr." He handed her a cup. Edward took the other. "This is terrible coffee," Marcus said. "It's honest coffee." Annie sipped hers and made a face. "It's definitely honest." For a moment, they stood together near the elevator. The billionaire, the former night cleaner, and the security chief who had refused to let a building stay silent. Nothing about it erased what had happened. Justice did not work that way. Richard Vale was awaiting trial. Linda Shaw had agreed to cooperate. The company still had wounds. Money could not polish over. Edward still had to answer for the culture he had built, the distance he had rewarded, the people he had failed to see. But something had shifted. Edward no longer walked past the staff corridors as if they were blank spaces. Annie no longer entered the building through doors meant to keep people like her unseen. Marcus no longer trusted systems just because executives had paid for them. Annie looked toward the conference rooms, where her internship orientation would begin in 10 minutes. "Nervous?" Edward asked. "Yes." "Good." She glanced at him. He said, "Your mother told me fear means you're paying attention." Annie smiled. "She charges for wisdom now?" "She should." They walked down the corridor together. At the first glass wall, Annie caught her reflection beside Edward's. She did not look like she belonged to his world yet. Maybe that was all right. Maybe the point was not to fit into rooms built without her in mind. Maybe the point was to learn them well enough to change where the doors were. Behind them, the elevator chimed again. Clean, steady. This time, no one flinched. The lesson of this story is that truth often comes from the person everyone else overlooks. Annie was not powerful, wealthy, or important in the eyes of the people who ran the tower, but she paid attention when others did not. Her courage saved a life because she trusted what she saw and heard, even when a powerful man dismissed her. The story reminds us that dignity does not come from money or position. It comes from character, honesty, and the willingness to speak up when silence would be easier. Sometimes justice begins with one ordinary person brave enough to say, "Stop. Something is wrong." This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.